Good morning. My name is Shlomi Dinar. I'm the Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual Miami Conference on Global Democracy. Thank you for joining us today as we explore the phenomenon of contemporary democratic backsliding on a global scale. We have an impressive lineup of guest speakers and expert panelists here, including members of our own Green School faculty, as well as other international authorities. And we greatly appreciate your participation, so thank you. I would like to recognize one of our guests here today, Dr. Kimberly Green. We are so thankful for the long time, very generous support of Kimberly and the Green family. Our world-renowned Latin American and Caribbean Center is named after Dr. Green, and our school is named after Ambassador Stephen J. Green. Kimberly, from all of us, thank you to you and your family. Today, we're going to shine a light on how waning public support for democracy, economic inequality and social tensions, popular politics, external pressures from great power competition, and the weakening of political institutions and processes have contributed to a steady decline in democracy worldwide. Last year, I opened this conference by telling you that according to Freedom House, global democracy had receded under pressure from authoritarian forces over the past 16 years. Unfortunately, we now have to increase that number to 17. 2023 was another discouraging year for democracy. Freedom House characterized it as a year of repression, violence, and a steep decline in overall freedom. Around the world, freedom weakened, and people's basic rights were repressed. Yet there were bright spots. There were places and moments that gave us reasons to be optimistic about the future of democracy. Despite discouraging signs of the backsliding of democracy, we firmly believe that it is still possible to reverse the decline. And we hope today to draw some lessons that can help strengthen democracy across the globe and build a better world. The topic of human rights and democratization, in fact, is a strategic theme here at the Green School. The subject of democracy plays a role in our faculty's research and teaching. For some, it's a central idea, while for others, it's a subtext, but it's an issue that cuts across much of the work at our school. We have two panels planned for today. The first is about sharp power, a coin termed in 2017 to describe the way authoritarian regimes use manipulative diplomatic policies to undermine democracy internationally. The second panel will look at how anti-democratic forces within a country work to secure political power by eroding the pillars of democracy. Over lunch, which I hope you'll stay for, our keynote speaker, Michael Camilleri of USAID, will talk about the relationship between democracy and economic development. I also want to thank our partners in presenting this conference, the Jarl Harmelson Foundation, and I'd like to welcome Peter Eckhart for being here today with us. And I'd also like to thank Freedom House as well for being here, and Adrian Shabazz, who you'll hear from in one of the panels very, very soon. So thank you to the Jarl Harmelson Foundation and Freedom House. I also want to thank our sponsors, the Dorothea Green Lecture Series and the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Democracy. Thank you all for being here with us for this important and meaningful day of exploring democracy. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mitzi Carter, who is going to introduce the first panel. I'd like to ask the first panel and the panelists and the moderator to please come up and take your seats. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to all the students who joined us, especially for, during finals week almost. So I'm Mitzi Uehara Carter, and I'm an assistant teaching professor of anthropology and East Asian studies here at FIU and the director of the Global Indigenous Forum at the Green School. It's my honor to be here with you all today and introduce this first panel for the conference. This session is called Defending Democracy in an Age of Sharp Power. The panelists will be discussing how authoritarian regimes attempt to undermine democracies today and how defense of them can be conceptualized and or enacted. How, for instance, can disinformation, the fear of diversity, attacks on free speech, increasing censorship in the public sphere shred the confidence of citizens and eventually undermine democratic processes? We know democracy and freedom are contested concepts, and a careful and nuanced approach is absolutely needed. The panelists will present their understandings of these complex terms beyond the taken for granted understandings of them, so that we can all come away with a more robust sense for what this phrase defense of democracy could mean to a broad range of people and states. As Dean Dinar mentioned, the term sharp power, which is part of this panel's title. And as he said, that this is a term that was popularized in 2017 in an article by Christopher Walker, who's here with us today, and his colleagues from the National Endowment for Democracy. And so we're going to be hearing more about what that means and how these scholars approach this concept of sharp power in their work. By the way, the book Defending Democracy in an Age of Sharp Power is available here in the lobby, so you can get a copy of that today. It was edited by our esteemed panelist, Christopher Walker. So thank you all again for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, Jessica Adler, Associate Professor of History here at the Green School. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Carter, and I want to echo Dr. Carter's thanks to all of you for being here. Time is the most valuable resource, and we appreciate yours. I'm really glad to be moderating this panel sitting alongside these esteemed scholars and researchers. Let me introduce them to you. We have Christopher Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. We have Glenn Tiffert, Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And finally, Eric Loeb, our own Associate Professor in the FIU Department of Politics and International Relations. So thanks to each of you for being here. And just to give you a roadmap for our panel, we're going to spend about 35 minutes with me posing questions to each of our experts, and then have about 20 minutes for you to ask questions and get some answers too. So I hope as you listen to our speakers, you'll conjure up some questions of your own for each of them. Okay, so I'm going to jump in and start with Christopher Walker, since you are the person who, as Dean Dinar mentioned, coined this term sharp power. Your book is sort of the shaper of this panel today. So I want to start with a basic question of course, please define for us sharp power, and then talk a little bit about why it is such a threat at this moment in time. But before you do that, I want to share and show this Washington Post headline from just yesterday. Secret Russian document offers rare official glimpse into campaign against West. Now, of course, when I saw this headline, I had been preparing for this panel, reading your work, and I thought, these panelists must be looking at this and thinking, that's not so remarkable, and I just found myself wondering, what did you think about this? Because you've been studying this, as we know, for years. And obviously, this is a little bit of a different news item because it's an official document that shows what you've been alarming people to for so long. But to start with that general question of please define sharp power, why it's such a threat, and then if you want to talk about your perceptions of this, and I put that out there for each of you. So please begin. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thank you for the question, and thank you to the organizers for pulling together this conference, which is very timely now. It's also a real pleasure to be here with Alina Polyakova, Glenn Tiffert. Alina was at the release of the original report we produced in 2017, and Glenn and his colleagues at the Hoover Institution have really taken the work relating to authoritarian influence in this context to a whole new level. And it's a pleasure to be here with colleagues from FIU as well. I think what I would say, just to talk about the concept, is there have been some I would call them flawed assumptions coming out of the Cold War and some complacency about the instruments that societies and systems use in the wider world. So from the perspective of the 1990s, there really wasn't a sense that countries like China or Russia, for example, would be exerting significant influence beyond their borders. And if they did, it would probably be something like democracies do in terms of education, media, culture, now technology, information, these sorts of things. But I think we, at a certain point, should have reflected a bit harder about what these instruments were actually doing, because countries like Russia, China, Cuba, which themselves do not permit free expression within their borders, which actually operate on the basis of misinforming and disinforming their publics as a matter of policy, which use corruption as a way to manage their own systems, they don't necessarily check those norms and behaviors at their borders when they start to operate beyond them. And I fear the biggest thing we missed over time was not recognizing that these countries wouldn't necessarily exert influence beyond their borders in the way we would think of a country in the European Union doing that, for example. And what my colleagues and I saw when we started to look at this more closely was that the features of the influence coming through these instruments, for example, Russian state media, which is not really news. I mean, we have to be clear that while there are cameras and people working in the outlets and the forms of what we would consider to be news, it's something different because it's actually, in the end, controlled by the political authorities in a dictatorship. And so when RT and Español operates across, for example, Latin America, a careful look at the content, the narratives, the perspectives there are not actually competitive, pluralistic news in the way one might imagine from another setting that's pluralistic and independent. It's something else. And I think we missed that, and we're only catching up now. And with China, this is now at scale globally. The other thing I would say in this context, in addition to the instruments that are used, authoritarian regimes have agency. I think there was also this sense that authoritarian regimes are just passive, they observe, they react, but they have preferences, they have goals. Those preferences are clear in the way they treat their own people, their own journalists, their own civil society. We can talk more about this. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's the intentions and effects of this engagement. So one of the things that really became clear and helped us build out a definition of sharp power was that the effects of China's engagement in university settings and cultural instances, not in every case, but in far too many cases for comfort, often had features of monopolizing ideas, suppressing alternative narratives, and exploiting partner institutions. Those are characteristics that are deeply at odds with pluralism, voluntarism, competition, all of the things one would see in the customary understanding from open societies of what was often called soft power, Joseph Nye's definition. All too often in these other cases with the projection of influence beyond borders from Russia, China, where they themselves do not permit free expression, political competition, had these features of monopolization of ideas, suppression of alternative narratives, and exploiting partner institutions. And I can give examples of this, but I think that's the key thing. And to your point on what we just saw, which is the latest of just an almost endless stream of examples, even since our book was published last year, that fall in this category, is just one of many of these kinds of things where you see subterfuge, opacity, and manipulation as the guiding features of behavior, as was the case with these Russian leaked documents, rather than openness, transparency, pluralism, and competition. I would say at a high order level, that's the distinction between what we see with this projection of authoritarian influence, in most cases, I would argue, compared with what the common assumptions and customary interpretation of such influence, looking from the view of open societies, has been.
Very helpful, thank you. So I think you're trying to help us understand the distinction between soft and sharp power. And the idea is that sharp power is used to erode trust, and soft power instead is used to build a public perception of positivity of the state that might be putting it forth. And so I think that's a key distinction. Before I move on to Glenn, I have one more question for you, just a basic to get us oriented. You mentioned Russia, you mentioned China. Can you talk to us about some of the seed beds of this problem, and also the concept of change over time? I mean, you started writing, you identified this term in 2017. Your book, and one of the last chapters in your book, the final chapters talk about successful efforts to combat sharp power, which we'll get to a little bit later. But one of the last chapters ends with a little section called Shifting Tides. And so I get the sense that we're at this moment where there's sort of a tide change. So can you walk us through very briefly sort of where we stand now and how things have changed over time in terms of the exhibition of sharp power?
So the short answer to that, I would say, is that the fundamental asymmetries that emerged in the last period of time after the Cold War really opened the door for authoritarian actors and their surrogates to exploit open institutions in free societies. Media, education, technology, it's a very large number of domains where this is possible. The good news is there's been a good deal of response in recent years undertaken both by the non-governmental sector and governments in many places. And so we should embrace that, but we certainly shouldn't be satisfied with that, because the depths, there was a very extensive article, just to give one example, in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago on the extent to which China and its proxies are engaged in the education sector in a host of different settings. And so that's going to be with us for quite some time. And so a change in mindset, a change in understanding, a change in the posture that free societies have is really going to be essential, because in a sense, another key aspect of this is we in open societies often feel that the metric of success would be, if you use this influence, you would be seen more positively. So often when you see these discussions, you say, oh, let's take a look at public opinion surveys and country X is less favorable or more. I think we really have to challenge ourselves to imagine what the leadership who are dominating the policies from Beijing and Moscow, Havana, and these places, how they view success here. I'm not necessarily convinced that they want to be liked or loved. I think those regimes at home want to be complied with, and they want obedience from the actors with which they engage. And so we should ask ourselves why that would be different beyond their borders. I think it's a really important question, whether they would seek obedience and compliance in a way that's different from what they seek at home.
Yeah, and you mentioned two key points, I think. One is, I think you identify, various authors in the book identify NGOs as a key sort of turning point of whether you can consider yourself an open society or not. Do you have NGOs, and are they controlled by the regime or the government? You also mentioned the education sector, and here I want to turn to Glenn. So Glenn, I think your area of expertise is China. And your chapter in Chris's book focuses on how that country uses sharp power to threaten democracy. So I mentioned this idea of coming around to combating this sharp power. Given that we're here today at a top-ranked public university, number 4, according to at least one ranking, I want to turn to your ideas specifically about higher education. So you write, quote, when institutions such as universities and publishers partner with entities based in authoritarian states, they expose themselves to perils. Democracy-based institutions must be prepared to shoulder responsibility for defending and upholding their values. And you mentioned that those values include the tolerance that lies at the heart of genuine intellectual freedom. So I want to ask you to help us think through these ideas in the context of current US politics and policy. So back in 2020, you offered a thoughtful analysis of a presidential proclamation 10043. It was signed in 2020. It restricts visas for postgraduate students with ties to China's military-civil fusion strategy. In 2023, the Florida legislature passed a wider-ranging law, SB 846, requiring that offers of graduate assistantships and fellowships to students from 7 so-called countries of concern, Cuba, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela, undergo review by a state board, even if they have met federal visa requirements. So there's a challenge to that in the courts right now because it, according to this lawsuit, presumptively prohibits people from conducting research at the state's public universities based on where they were born. So I want to scope out and say that this law comes about as, Dean Dinar mentioned the Freedom House rankings. The US has been downgraded from a full to a flawed democracy. And it's also a time when multiple states are passing laws that many argue actually restrict intellectual freedom, which is at the heart of the values of an open society. So the question here is, how can democracy-based institutions like universities navigate balancing openness and vigilance at a moment when there is so much tension about how to even define and protect democratic values?
That is the question. As a Floridian, I grew up in this state. I have a personal attachment to getting this right here. Let me backtrack for a minute to lay some context. For decades, America's top research partners were all other liberal democracies. It was a very small club. And so because of that, you could make a lot of assumptions in how you work with partners in those other countries. They have rule of law, they had free media, they had institutional autonomy in their higher education sector, faculty enjoyed academic freedom, and so on. You didn't have to encode that into your relationships because you could rely that if you worked with a partner in Canada, Australia, Germany, Italy, in biomedical research, they would respect similar norms of human subjects treatment and norms of human rights. So we didn't build those things into our architecture of international collaboration. Suddenly, in the last 15 years, China has emerged across that club of countries, in many cases as the top international collaborator. In the United States, it is our top international collaborator by far, double the next country, which is the UK. We have not adapted to that new normal. And the challenge is, for all the right reasons, we don't want to treat any country differently. On principle, there's this idea of country agnosticism, but that's also an ideological position that's in defiance of actual reality, because China is not like Canada. And to treat China like Canada and our collaborations with China the same is foolish, suicidal, and not a sustainable strategy. And so there has now been an awakening that China, in fact, behaves differently. Chris has played a big role in this. And that China poses particular challenges with regard to technology transfer, misappropriation of knowledge, theft, but also affecting the narratives and discourses within our universities and affecting the safety of students on our campuses through transnational repression. Now, the challenge is, for 40 years, we welcomed China in, hoping to transform it, hoping it would become more like us. That's a gamble that did not pay off. And now we've been seized by a moral panic, and we've swung very hard in the other direction. And I think the Florida law reflects that we must do something. But we have not yet built the architecture infrastructure to make the nuanced decisions to do the right thing. And the key thing here is it's easy to have the door wide open to invite people in. It's easy to slam it shut. The hard part is finding the balance in between. And this is a shared problem. It requires all the stakeholders in the higher ed system to participate. It requires government, which has a role in national security and economic competitiveness terms. It requires people at the university president level and at the provost level who are eager to sort of make legacies for themselves and sign partnership agreements with other universities. It requires people at the PI level also to have consciousness. At the PI level, how do we reward our faculty? We reward them for publications. And so if someone shows up with a fully funded lab and a raft of postdocs from China and a lot of talent and says, hey, I'd like to work with you on this area of research, we've incentivized our faculty to just say yes, because they're measured on their productivity. We can't expect them to behave differently if we reward them to do something else. So what we need to do is develop really good analytical capability to detect where the risk is and where the risk isn't. We don't have that yet, and so that leads to really crude, kind of blunt instruments, which unfortunately I think risk breaking the system rather than improving it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that phrase of it's easy to open the doors, it's easy to close the doors. The trick is to find the place in between. That's great, thank you. And I want to talk more about your point about analytical ability, because I think that's also key from what I've read, you know, in terms of sharp power. Is there's a lot of, and I think we were talking about this last night at dinner, how do you measure cause and effect? How do you measure the actual the actual, you know, the real-time results of these actions? So thank you. So Alina, I want to turn to, for you, an important tool of sharp power and one that's been a focus of your work, and that's disinformation, and you can expand or contract that term as you wish. Thinking specifically of a 2019 publication that you co-authored called Democratic Defense Against Disinformation. So you wrote, democratic societies can combat and mitigate the challenge of foreign disinformation while working within democratic norms. You argued that at that point, 5 years ago, democratic societies had moved beyond a sort of existential despair and entered a period of trial and error. And the report ended with a multifaceted call to action for democracies to work more collaboratively to combat disinformation and more aggressively regulate social media companies. And about a year later, you followed up offering congressional testimony about the same topic, focusing specifically on Russia's threats in this realm. So if you could give us a sense of your major findings related to disinformation, and more importantly, how things have changed in the last 4 or 5 very eventful years in terms of the nature of the threat as well as how to manage it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for that question, and it's great to be here with such fantastic colleagues. Even though we're next door in Washington, we have to come to Miami to see each other, Chris. And so thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here at FIU with all of you. If I may, I'm just going to expand out on your question a little bit. You know, as someone who, in my research hat and analytical hat, has worked on tools of information warfare for a really long time before, certainly I think we cared about it in this country, which we obviously started caring about it in 2016, but we definitely didn't care about it before, to be clear. But in other countries that I would call frontline states, especially when it comes to Russian asymmetric and political warfare, they've been dealing with this forever. I mean, for decades and decades. And I think speaking to what Chris was bringing up, that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a moment where, you know, of this unipolarity, where we thought, okay, we're done. You know, this sharp power, as we now call it, is not a problem. Of course, we knew about the kinds of so-called active measures, as the term of art, the Soviet Union carried out across the world, which is another way of thinking about some of these tools that we're discussing here. We thought that was done. But in Russia, that wasn't done. And I think over time, there was a lot of learning that happened between authoritarian states, talking about agency on the authoritarian side. You know, we think democracies can learn from each other because we have open societies and we have information exchange at different levels of society. But you have the same kind of dynamics of authoritarian learning as well. And I can tell you, even though the KGB is not called the KGB anymore, there are other intelligence agencies that have replaced it in name, but not in function. And I think we've actually seen over the last years a real ramp up and a doubling down by Russia in particular in these kinds of tools of sharp power. And it's become even more profound and far more dangerous for the last 2 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we are not, I can tell you, we are not responding in the same way. So as they're doubling down, we're not. And I think, how do we get to a different place there? And specifically, I think in the information operation environment, you know, I've had these conversations about what do we do about foreign-aligned information influence ops for over 10 years. And I find it frustrating, frankly, because we're still very much asking the same questions and we're still very much in the same place. But the world has changed quite profoundly just over the last 5 years, not even the last 10 years. And you know, the report you mentioned, it was actually one of 3 that I wrote with my co-author, Ambassador Dan Fried. And the last one was about offense. Because I've become convinced that defense is not enough. Democratic societies have an ability to be resilient, But if that is all we are, we will fail. And until we learn how to respond in democratic ways to the kinds of undermining challenges, destructive capabilities that authoritarian states like Russia and China have developed and deployed against us and our allies and partners across the world, we're not going to survive the phase of geopolitical restructuring that we are currently living through. And so thinking about what that means, just a couple of things I would maybe highlight. I think when we talk about the use of technologies and this idea of digital authoritarianism, that sharp power, I think, captures a big idea of which it's just a conversation we should have at some point as a side note, Chris, about how do we see digital authoritarianism in the context of sharp power is really a subset to that. We have to recognize that technological tools, AI is the big one everyone's talking about now, are dual use. And we tend to go black and white. We tend to either think social media is going to destroy democracy. But before that, we thought social media was going to save democracy, right? And it's this complete 180. And now we think, okay, AI is going to kill us all, right? And I think I'm starting to see a similar shift in our conversations on AI as we saw around social media as well. We have not gotten the social media environment right, and I think companies have realized that the US Congress will not regulate them, and they're quite limited. And I think they're following that same logic when it comes to AI. But I think this is the moment where I think we have an opportunity to also see how these tools, and there are some very specific tools, can be used in the service of fighting for freedom and fighting for open societies. And again, going back to countries that have been dealing with this for generations, Ukraine being number one, but also countries where you have freedom fighters that are still operating despite great risk to themselves in authoritarian regimes. Belarus being one, Russia, of course, a very dangerous place, China, Hong Kong, right? I think there's a lot of hubris that we still have in Western societies where we don't take the time to learn from these other places and these individuals that have actually developed the capability to get accurate and independent information out there, to still organize despite great risk to themselves and their colleagues. And we're not in that mentality in the West. We're still living in a bubble of, I would say, false security. And that is why we tend to see things as benign when they are actually not. But it is our tendency to do so. And I think for generations, we've had the privilege of living in relative peace and security. But that is over. It is over. And that hasn't, I think, quite seeped in, that we really have to be on a war footing, not just in a place like Ukraine. The outcome of that war will be absolutely detrimental if the Russians win to the United States and democracy writ large, but also in the war for hearts and minds at the end of the day, and in the war for influence. That doesn't actually take that much. It just takes a complete rethinking of how we engage as governments in public diplomacy. We have all of our embassies across the world. I don't think we've switched how we do diplomacy in many countries. And we're losing the battle as we speak. And I think we really need to step it up.
Yeah, I want to learn more about what you all think offense looks like, and whether what we're seeing is democracy is trying to use soft power to combat sharp power. But I want to turn to you, Eric, and then open it up for questions. So please be at the ready. Eric, your 2020 book, Iran's Reconstruction Jihad, offers perspective on how an organization focused on rural development used what you call non-coercive tactics to build power after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So we have here a scholar who does not study sharp power per se, but who studies a regime that might be considered one that uses sharp power. So I want to talk to you about the research process when you're trying to understand the machinations of a state that is an oppressive regime. So your extensive research for the project consisted of conducting interviews and searching archives. So tell us what that was like, what it's like to try to conduct interviews and actually figure out how power works in one of these states.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, it's first of all, again, thanks to the organizers, and it's an honor to be here with such distinguished panelists and guests. But in terms of, yeah, trying to conduct research in an authoritarian setting, it's obviously quite challenging. I mean, for some countries, because I also attempted to do so in other countries as well, where you immediately see the red lines, but in a country like Iran, actually, where there's all these different factions, you don't always see the red lines, which is a blessing and a curse. And so sometimes you think you're not stepping on someone's toes, or whose toes am I stepping on among all these factions? And then before you know it, you've stepped on someone's toes. I mean, I just feel very fortunate that I was able to conduct the research that I did for as long as I did. And then, the message came pretty quickly after 3 visits for several months at a time that it was time to now leave the country. And then I had a colleague after me who was incarcerated for several years. So doing much less sensitive research, and there's not always logic to it as well. But I'm happy to be on this panel because looking at this organization in Iran, which was Iran's development organization, which I looked at it really exclusively when I was doing my dissertation and book through the spectrum or lens of soft power, because there's such a disproportionate focus on Iran's hard power capabilities. And so this organization was established right alongside the Revolutionary Guard. And I looked at how it used education, media culture, development to not only consolidate power internally, but also to expand Iran's influence abroad to the Muslim and developing world, very much operating like an organization or agency like USAID. And so I ended up doing research not just on Iranian history and politics, but also Iran using development aid, reconstruction, and these soft power tools to expand its influence in regions like Africa, and I'm looking more recently now at Latin America. And now I'm thinking, it's not just about soft power, it's also about sharp power. And there's a consistency to the policy where Iran is not just using this agency to conclude political, economic, and military agreements, but also to partner with the very institutions that we're talking about in these continents, educational institutions, cultural institutions, and media, and even investing and partnering in those areas. So not just so that it could bolster its soft power and those of its local or regional allies, and increase, as Nye would say, their attractiveness and improve their image, but also to control to the extent that it can. And of course, we should separate. I always try to separate intentionality from actual outcomes. But discourses and narratives, as we talked about. One other thing I'll say quickly about Iran is that I think another area that we have to pay a lot of attention to, and it's getting more and more publicity now, is when you look at Iran's security doctrine, it consists of 4 elements, and nuclear capability is not one of them. So it has 4 areas: drones, missiles, proxies, and the 4th one is cyber. And Iran it's less sophisticated than China and Russia, but it's been increasingly active in that space in terms of cyber and influence operations. It's since the Gaza war since October 7th, we've seen those activities drastically escalate, targeting Israel in different ways using cyber capabilities. And then, of course, not surprisingly, Iran was very active in that area in our 2020 election and will likely be very active in that area in 2024 as an area of not just retribution, but as we talk about manipulation and as a tool of destabilization and to leverage and exploit the polarization that is increasingly becoming a problem in democratic states and societies.
Thank you, Eric. So I think what we're seeing is countries are learning from one another, governments are learning from one another. I have more questions, but I want to now open it up to the audience. Yes, please, if you care to, please introduce yourself before you speak. And
Hi, my name is Michael Litke. I had a question that pertains to the Belt Road Initiative in China. I'm curious, hearing from anyone from the panel, whether or not you believe that the Belt Road Initiative was introduced by China as a means of avoiding containment by the West with their outcry that the Americans are trying to contain them by their alliances with South Korea and Japan and so on and so forth, Philippines, Taiwan, what have you. And it's their way of being able to expand westward because they can't go eastward, and whether or not they're using the Belt Road Initiative to not only project economic power and to expand their economy, but also as a means of projecting their political ideology to Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, Central Asia, and what have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glenn, I think this is your territory.
Okay. Happy to take that on. I think it's really important not to treat the actors, and I think Eric's point about how there are lots of factions and different perspectives coming out of Iran is critical here. Within China's government, the Belt and Road meant many things to many people. Yes, there was an intentionality to use it as an opportunity for China to go out into the world and make the world a more permissive place for China and to win allies in global competition with the West. So there was a geostrategic, geopolitical dimension to it, very much so. But there was also a very strong dimension in which China had, its growth model was about hyper-investment and laying as much concrete and building as much rail as possible. And it had begun to reach the limits of that domestically. And so exporting all of that excess capacity was part of what the Belt and Road Initiative was also. And I think to Alina's point about how we're not thinking competitively, we're talking about competition, but we're not actually competing, and we're going around in circles for years. You know, China is going to countries, particularly in the global south, and it is lending them immense amounts of money, playing in countries in which elite corruption is a deep problem, and throwing as much money around as possible, and offering them things they want. And there's an utter failure on the part of the West writ large to compete in that space. So for example, China shows up and says, Nigeria, you want a mobile phone network? Here you go. And citizens, I mean, everybody wants nice, shiny things, right? They want the lifestyles that they see on television in the West. They want the things that we enjoy. China is subsidizing that. Yes, it's sort of mortgaging the futures of those countries by lending them unsustainable debts, but that's somebody else's problem to solve 5 or 10 years from now, right? Instead, and I mean, this is one of the key problems too, in these weakly institutionalized democracies in the global south that actually have to deliver goods to their people every electoral cycle, leaders will take that money and say, we just built you a new railway, courtesy of China. So it actually exploits the weaknesses within those countries, much to the sort of, and it corrodes the institutions from the inside. But the Belt and Road is also part of a package of other initiatives. It was the first of now 4. There is the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. And you might tack on something beyond that, which is what's called Whole Process People's Democracy. And this is China's really sort of methodical piece-by-piece construction of a coherent alternative worldview backed by massive development finance to say, we are the story of the 21st century, the post-Bretton Woods arrangements, the Western, you know, alliance structure, everything, that's history, it's all declining. We have the answer for the new world, and it's presenting that to the global south. And we have not presented a coherent, positive message to compete with it across the full spectrum, either economically or culturally or ideologically. We forgot how to do that. Yeah.
Please. Would you like the audio? Here, why don't you use mine?
Oh my God, that's so funny. Oh, she's got it. No worries. Sorry to be disruptive.
I just want to know, I was willing.
No, thanks. No, you are willing to participate. Thank you. I appreciate that. As am I. We're going to ignore that. So, hello. First off, thank you so much, every single one of you. I was scribbling down as quickly as I could because I love all the content you've brought up. My question mainly stems from what Mr. Walker and Glenn, sorry, I forgot your last name.
Fine.
But yes, Christopher and Glenn, what you guys said. So one thing I will say is I wish I knew about sharp power when I was taking Dr. Araras' class, because that definitely would have helped me out. But what you said about that helped me contextualize the role of authoritarian government, media, and the people. So I think that can be taken in either a state level, like as a country, or a state level as in Florida, Glenn, because I really appreciate what you had to say about how we as universities are trying to balance, discourse, but also being within lines of state laws. So for both of you guys, I wanted to know how media can impact certain policies in countries or states, especially when they have authoritarian governments or authoritarian laws. Because one of the things I've never understood is how in the authoritarian government, the room where it happens, you hear about sharp power, but you hear about sharp power months later after intelligence documents come out. Like the media doesn't have the opportunity to stop sharp power when it's happening before, democratic institutions can crumble, fail, because the people are not able to voice their opinions via the media to the authoritarian government. So hope that makes sense, and thank you again for your contributions.
Thank you. Chris, you want to start?
Sure, and thanks very much for the question. I'd also note in the Belt and Road Initiative context, there's something called the Belt and Road News Network, which is an initiative that's wrapped around the Belt and Road activity, essentially to inform or propagandize, depending on how you look at it, projects and efforts where the Belt and Road is active. One way to think about the authoritarian media question is that, and I think my colleagues and co-editors, Will Dobson and Tarek Masood, in their opening chapter said that the efforts that come from the leading authoritarians look to deepen and anchor authoritarianism where it already exists and look to undermine it where it's in process or in democratic settings. And so I would say that if you look at I'll start with a country like Belarus, where the people in Belarus want change and they've fought for it courageously. The dictator who rules Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has a lot of help, including from Russia, from Moscow. And so, in essence, the people of Belarus, which is a country of about 9 or 10 million people, are battling their own dictatorship, but they're also battling dictatorships in Russia and China who provide different sorts of support. And I mention this because one of the things that's understood to have happened when the people of Belarus were really pushing the regime is that the authorities in Russia supplied support in a variety of ways, including in the media sphere. So they literally were providing propaganda professionals who came and helped the Belarusian state media wither the storm there. It's just one example. So there's this case of kind of bolstering other authoritarian settings with media support. But in this environment, I think what we really need to focus on, and it's relevant to what all of my co-panelists have been alluding to, is that in wide open media space, what you see is in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, just incredible amounts of investment and engagement from Russia in the media space there. And often what happens is the broadcast content, which may not itself have a whole lot of audience, is actually used as a content factory that's then fed into social media streams of different sorts. See that in Russia for sure. China's learned very quickly how to do that. And China's in a league of its own. They are operating both through its state media channels, through things like CGTN, which is its global broadcast network, China Radio International, through their newspaper networks of all stripes that we see, but as importantly, through the partnerships that they engage with news enterprises in open societies. And Glenn was alluding to some of the challenges we face in open societies in the education sector. I think we've been very slow to understand the boundaries, the standards that need to be in place for these agreements that are, they happen everywhere. And so there's nowhere that's immune to this. So I don't want to suggest that this is region or country specific, but China attempts to engage in these partnerships everywhere. And then the question is, how prepared are the societies and systems that have these offers? And I think the answer to date has been not prepared enough. And so it's a big deal because then there are pathways for systematic narratives, shaping of information that's consistent with the preferences of the leadership in Beijing. So that's a key point. When we talk about, let's say, I'll use Germany as an example. If Germany engages overseas through its private media, through Deutsche Welle, through its other public instruments. These in and of themselves are already pluralistic. So, you know, if the Süddeutsche Zeitung or the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or any of these newspapers or channels are engaging, they're competing with other German outlets in a sense. There's no central control, and they're surely not doing this for the preferences of the executive political leadership in the country. That's not true in China and Russia's case. It's actually something different there. And that's something I think we still haven't internalized sufficiently in open societies to say, wait, this probably isn't suitable as a partnership or something that we're going to systemically invite into our media space.
Alina.
Yeah, just to chime in on the conversation on media, because I think there's a tendency to see, and Chris is exactly right, that in societies where you haven't had decades of investment that have produced robust civil society, independent media, those are ripe for opportunities for influence, right, with money, you know. But it's also happening in Europe, and it's happening in the United States. Our traditional media space is collapsing. Newspapers are closing all over. They're desperate for money. That is an opportunity. It doesn't even take that much to operate some of these local outlets. It's happening in the Balkans very, very significantly for many, many years, where you have investments, relatively minimal investments from Russia and China that are literally buying up news organizations who are about to collapse. And, you know, it looks benign. I mean, there's a pattern. It looks benign. It's just funding. You have resources. It's great. But you slowly, there's things you can't write, you know, and that message is communicated in all kinds of different ways. And I think we are also missing that, you know, these tentacles, they're not just, you know, somewhere over there in the so-called global south, which is a very challenging term because we're talking about dozens and dozens of countries. But it's also happening in what we would call European democracies. It's happening here in the United States. So it's not something that is out there somewhere. It is home, it is here. And I think the challenge that I think maybe Chris is starting to go towards, that I don't put words in your mouth, is, you know, how do you now strike this balance between still having an open society, but also understanding that you have to think about security? Like, what kinds of policies does that lead us to, right? You want to have an open liberal economy with competitive investment models, but what does it mean when those investors have other political intentions and strategies behind their investments, right? How do you parse that out? Do you start to have something like a CFIUS at the EU level, which we have in the United States for foreign investment, but it has to go far, far beyond that, because that's really a private sector issue and a critical technology issue. We're not really thinking big picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually compelled by something that I've read from Glenn, but I want to let you speak, Glenn, because you might be saying what I'm about to say that you said. So please go ahead, and then we'll take your question.
We'll see. You know, I think we would be really remiss if we don't focus on the agency of the people who are complicit in the sharp power and to only focus on the malign intent of the state actors coming out of Iran, Russia, China, Syria, and other countries. In particular, especially, I'll use the term global south, others say global majority, but I think we broadly know the countries we're talking about. Many of the political regimes there have very powerful interests, and they want to stay in power as long as possible. Their presidents very often would like to stay in power as long as possible, too. China is actually offering them a path to do that. In fact, it pays for large delegations from media organizations, legislators at the national level, and mid-level bureaucrats to come to China and learn from the Chinese model, and says, this is how we create a more permissive, well-behaved media environment that doesn't challenge the government. In fact, that amplifies government talking points. Wouldn't you like something like that too? This is how you do it. This is the legislative language. And so then they go back to their capitals and they begin sort of implementing that out. And that happens in the regulation of social media and internet in those countries, in the regulation of journalist associations and licensing. all of that. And so China is just investing in bringing these delegations to China and selling that model. And we are not doing anything in return. So it is having influence. And it's affecting the discourse and the space for democratic discussion in those countries.
And I was just going to add that, Alina's point about media, and you have, I think, written about the fact that that it's an uneven playing field. That even though because the sharp power exploits the very freedom that open societies are supposed to embrace, meaning there are no rules about who can advertise in our newspapers, et cetera, but the U.S. government cannot use its soft power mechanisms to publish anything in Chinese media. So that's an interesting point, I think. I promised this person in the back, and then we'll come back to this side.
Thank you. This might be a segue because I've been a reporter, and so I think I'm a bit more aware of the media space. But I had a question. My name is Kevon Antonio, and I wanted to ask, has there been any surveys or metrics? And because we're talking about belief and communication systems, and also how to transform this into a lever of power, be it soft or hard power. So has there been an index or a metric or surveys that say whether people believe or prefer a situation where they skew towards democracy or autocracy? Autocracy is like, let somebody else take care of it. I just want to deal with my stuff, my family, my business, my work. And democracy is, hey, I want to get involved and I want to have a voice in the messy exercise of government, and as it gets messier and messier. That comes from the metrics viewpoint, but there's also the storytelling aspect. And I think there's an anecdote that I think says a lot, which also ties in with our current situation, which in Russia, they tried to do a version of The Apprentice and exporting our cultural power to that market. And they said, no, it was failure because nobody believed that anybody would get ahead just on the power of your ideas and your connections and your marketing push, because they said, in Russia, the way we get things done is your connections and who you know and who you bribed. And so under that system, under that belief system, I don't have to say The Apprentice is the one that launched Donald Trump into the trajectory that we're on now. So I'm wondering, has there been an index or a study of whether people skew towards autocracy or democracy in their belief and communication system?
And please feel free to reference a case study or an example if you wish. But
So I'm happy to take a shot. I think the polling data of people in so many settings tends to generally reflect people's desire to have a fair hearing, accountable government, the ability to freely express themselves, all the things that in the aggregate would lead to democratic accountability and human rights. Hard to achieve that in practice for some of the reasons we're discussing here. I think some of the points that Alina and Glenn referenced in the media context are terribly important because this has been a long-term set of factors that have led us to very weak media in our own societies, which opens the door for exploitation. And at the same time, in the digital age, malign actors of all sorts have really figured out how to leverage that space. And it's not journalism in the way we might have discussed it in the early 1990s, with more accountability, more time for reflection because the news cycles actually ended, and so forth and so on. Here we're talking about in open societies. I think we're at a really pivotal point in trying to figure out, as Alina was suggesting, how to make sure that the openness of the media environment reflects people's needs as citizens in open societies, but also recognizes the security dimension, which is a very tricky thing, especially, say, in a country with the First Amendment standards. And that's what we're grappling with now. I mean, we're right in the thick of it. And if we had great answers, we probably would have already applied them. But my sense is, both on data I've seen, and then just generally from speaking to people, is that people prefer the ability to express themselves and not to be suppressed or repressed. And I think part of our charge is to figure out in this environment how to make sure that that is more the case than less the case.
Glenn?
So there is good panel level data longitudinally across broad regions of the world. For example, the Africa Barometer projects and the Asia Barometer projects, which consistently record that people at the level of like principle abstractly favor democracy and the set of values and institutions that go along with democracy. But it won't surprise you to learn that, you know, across all those countries as well as our own, there's a sort of disconnect between the idea of democracy and the performance of democracy. And democracy has experienced a performance legitimacy crisis now in a great large part of the world. And so I think addressing that concern is key here to ensure that democracy remains the attractive option in the implementation that we always assumed that it was, because really nothing sells like success.
That would be part of the offense, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yes. One sec, just wait for your microphone.
I can't use my Bronx.
Just use it in the microphone.
Speaking of the Bronx,
It's on.
okay, I hate these things. Speaking of the Bronx, that disconnect that actually, it's a perfect, what I wanted to say was a perfect follow-up, I think, to Kayvon's question or statement. Ever since I was a kid in public school in the Bronx, I never understood the disconnect. But I mean, I was pretty young. I never understood the disconnect between I vote and I get results. My life, my everyday life is affected by that. So I'm sitting here so frustrated and glad that I probably won't live long enough to see all of this inevitability happen. And at the same time, extremely frustrated that there's not not just one solution. I think about the horror of George Floyd and how that motivated the population. And I'd like to know if there is any solution that would be positive, wake up we the people, because we the people seem to want to keep we the people in a democratic zone, and seal that disconnect. You know, we could get Kim Kardashian to do any one of a number of things and there'd be millions of followers, but we can't seem to get the population to understand we're at risk. How we know the great analyses and it's very frustrating. Is there any solution to this?
It's a great question, and it brings us to an important point, which is to get at some perhaps case studies where things have worked out in terms of people opposing sharp power or just ideas for hope. So if anybody wants to speak to case studies where this has been fought, and then maybe share some ideas for how democracies can go on the offense. Alina.
I'm happy to start because in the reports that you mentioned, I mentioned we do some case studies, particularly frontline states that I mentioned have been dealing with very, very aggressive tactics in the sharp power domain for a long time. I think there's a question about scalability to a country like the United States, because you have countries like Estonia, for example, like Sweden, who I think have generally done a very good job in sort of building out what the Swedes actually call psychological defense. And I know we have some people from Sweden here who may know a lot more about this. You know, and I think that you have an ability in a smaller, more homogeneous country to build much deeper ties and communication between local grassroots civil society, local governments, the mid-level kind of, you know, state-level type government structures, and then national-level structures. And that's easier in a society that is smaller, that is more integrated in some ways, and that has a legacy of kind of collective thinking, if you will, which we don't have in this country. But there are some effective governmental tools that have been developed, and also civil society tools. We have, everyone knows about trolls, but there have also been these organizations that call themselves the elves for a long time that go out and try to push back against either propaganda or disinformation from state actors. There are things like this happening. I think the frustrating part is we don't live in an authoritarian state. But what that means is that all these things have to happen in a much more organic way. And sometimes it's hard to see all of those pieces and how they fit together. So I do think there are people out there implementing solutions, but I think your bigger question of what's it gonna take for all of us to wake up as a collective about the threats that we face, and I have a very depressing thought there for you. I'm already depressed. And I hope I'm wrong, but I think especially in the US and in many Western European countries, we've become so complacent and we've taken so for granted the security and peace in which multiple generations have now grown up in that we cannot imagine. It's a failure of imagination that we're suffering from. I recall a few days before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I was at this gathering of leaders in Munich, and nobody thought, they couldn't imagine. All the signs were there, but denial is such a powerful thing. And we have a tendency as humans to think that what's happened before will continue to happen in the future. Mm-hmm. And how do you break that bubble? I honestly think it's not going to happen until we have a war, a pretty massive one that will lead to a lot of horrible destruction. But it's the only way that I unfortunately, I don't know how you wake people up.
And I have a candidate for that war. It's Taiwan. Yeah.
Eric.
No shortage of war in the Middle East. And we also have an Arab barometer. But no, I mean, I always think about the chicken and the egg, right? Are these influence operations responsible for some of the polarization that we're seeing here? Yeah. Or are they just feeding on our vulnerabilities, right? And if we can somehow wake up, right, and reinforce our institutions, reinforce our society, somehow find ways to mitigate, if it's possible, polarization, then maybe we wouldn't have to worry as much about these influence operations, right? We'd be a healthier organism against them, and they wouldn't be as effective. Some of the ideas that have been bounced around the panel, the U.S. does. I mean, at one point, I knew people in the State Department. They had the International Visitors Program, right? Brought people from different sectors to the U.S. to, share our model with them and our successes and maybe some of our challenges. China, bringing delegates over is something we do as well. And I mean, the question is when you talk about what China's doing and, the so-called global South, right? Elite capture, playing into models of corruption and elite capture, is that really something that the United States is even equipped to do, right? I mean, if our model is not selling, when we bring delegates over here or when we're engaged in public diplomacy and other activities overseas, then, is it possible to reconcile things that we find other actors doing that are, quote unquote, unsavory, to play the same game? Or is somehow do we have to reconfigure our entire model? Maybe some of the other panelists have thoughts. I mean, the last thing I'll say too is our media is also configured differently here compared to Europe, right? We have increasing consolidation of media around, our own oligarchs, if we want to call them, or large corporations, versus in Europe, you look at, for example, The Guardian that relies on donations from readers and other revenue streams. So, we have to also not look at the West as a monolith and see how, what are the strengths and vulnerabilities of these different systems, across the transatlantic divide.
I just want to chime in that the case studies in the Sharp Power book of successful combating of sharp power, Taiwan, Australia, I think that Czech Republic, a thread through there is the successful tactics did not involve government stepping in and closing doors. The successful tactics involved NGOs and citizens coming together and embracing the notion of freedom and fighting together. Yeah. And so I just think that was a thread in those. And so that's useful to keep in mind.
It's not one and done either. See, that's the thing. It's an ongoing struggle. Right. Yeah.
Right, and it's trial and error, like you
Watch
said.
Poland.
I think that the person in the back with the orange shirt has had their hand up for, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if I need it. It's fine. Okay, so my name is Liz. Thank you, everyone. This was an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed everything. One thing that really stuck with me was that the West is not doubling down the way these authoritarian regimes are doing so, and they are able to buy out, like, the global South, and the West is not doing that. I feel like a lot of countries in the global South are screaming now, they need help, and they're asking, they're calling, they're saying, well, you say you are for democracy, and that's what you want to implement around the entire world. Well, we need that, because right now we're having like more and more, people who are flirting with a line of dictatorship, and they're saying that's not what we want. They're going to the United Nations, they're saying we need help, but it's not, it feels like the West is picking and choosing who needs help, who deserves aid, whose democracy is more important. So, and then the West also is saying, well, we do not want to intervene because that would violate a state's sovereignty. So how do you balance off that idea of doubling down and not being left out behind for the West, because Russia and China are not doing that. They're giving aid to whoever wants it, whoever will take it. And now these states who are seeking help are saying, well, the US is not going to help me. The UK is not going to help me. France is not going to help me. So might as well go to that person who's willing to help me. And, my population is getting killed every day. People are suffering. If this fires back in 10 years, I don't really care. I need a solution right now. So how does the West make sure preemptively they are not setting themselves for failure by not helping these other people who are fighting for their democracy, but it's not working? Thank you.
Well put. So I think we're talking about economic diplomacy to some extent. Any takers?
There's a really easy thing we can do. It's so easy, it's obvious, and most people, I think, don't even realize how much we have sort of dropped the ball. Large parts of the world lack US ambassadors for years. And if you've got nobody in the driver's seat of the US embassy in a country, there's nothing happening. It's in stasis. People are just sort of kicking the ball forward, right? And that's a function of our political process, our dysfunctional political process. But I mean, Solomon Islands is a great example. For 25 years, we shut down the embassy there. We had no embassy there. We outsourced our foreign policy in Oceania to Australia and New Zealand, who neglected it or did not pursue American interests and take care of them. And when we finally woke up to the fact that the Solomon Islands was tipping into China's team, and corruption was getting worse, it was too late to put that fire out because we had not invested there. And now we've reopened an embassy, but it's too late. And you look across large parts of Africa, also, nobody in the ambassador's seat. So if we want to compete, let's start competing.
But just to another point here, because I do think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, right? But in terms of how much Western countries bilaterally combined with international Western institutions are contributing, I don't have the numbers for every single country in the global South, but I would bet that for the majority of these countries, we are the largest supporters, financial supporters. It is not Russia, I guarantee it. Russia is not the dominant supporter in a single one of these countries. I don't think it's China in most of these countries, though I don't know the numbers.
You're right.
There may be one or two where they're more dominant, but probably 95%, if you combine Western support, it is Europe, is the United States, is the World Bank, is the IMF, is the EBRD, is this entire global international system that is there, that is present, but it's not being recognized by the people there, and you have to ask yourselves, why is that? So there's all these surveys I know of the Balkans that ask, who do you think is, that ask the population, some question like, who do you think is contributing the most to your country? And they're often saying crazy things like China and Russia. And if you look at the numbers, like Thailand gives more support in some of these countries than Russia or China, but that's not the perception. So what we're really talking about is a perception problem, which goes back to this bottom line question of information, communication, and sharp power, right? So there's also just this gap of knowledge and a gap of understanding what's actually being done. And to your point about ambassadors, it is so important, and nobody talks about it because the US Congress is sitting and holding these appointments hostage for all kinds of different reasons. But we haven't even used our diplomatic capacity across the world. When we do have embassies, why isn't every single US ambassador or acting ambassador, chargé, whatever, going out there and talking about this stuff? And why aren't we talking to local communities? In some places we are, but we're so cautious, and that's because we haven't flipped. We haven't flipped the switch.
And I know we have a lot of questions, but just to Alina's point, which I want to amplify, our colleague Peter Kreko, who's a Hungarian scholar, has written about what he calls authoritarian inflation, and he actually alludes to the case in Serbia, where, if I recall, Europe gives by orders of magnitude more support to Serbia, and the public opinion polling is almost completely reversed. And so the perception is that China gives 80% of the support, or whatever the number is. In reality, they give less than 20, and Russia's in the same boat. It's because the efforts to share the ostensible generosity are much stronger in information terms coming from China and Russia than it is coming from Brussels. And it's an important point.
And the visibility of the project.
I mean, just to add also what you're saying, in terms of thinking about the configuration of U.S. foreign policy and the 3 Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development. I mean, there's such an imbalance from a resource perspective, budgetary, from a budget perspective, right? And so winning the war of sharp power may not involve traditional military tools, right? And then we may need to reconfigure that if it's possible again, right? Or if there's just been so much momentum in that direction it's difficult to reverse. But if more resources need to be allocated to diplomacy and development, maybe we'd be on a stronger footing, with resources to embassies, with public diplomacy, information and communications that is a lot of it being tied up in defense, which could also play a role in other aspects. But
Thank you all. We are basically out of time, but I did promise one more question up front, and then we will wrap up. But I want to thank everybody for thoughtful questions. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you for an excellent panel, really great. The core of the problem has been up to discussion here today. Coming from Sweden, I can say it helps to be close to Russia. It's a sort of vaccine. But we have been able also to, due to the civil society, due to open society and the mechanism in open society, we have been able to take the discussion about Russia since more or less 2007 or the year before. And that is a very important aspect and experience, because we don't want to have McCarthy back. I don't mean Kevin McCarthy, I mean Eugene McCarthy. We want to preserve our climate and our academic standards. The problem is, of course, how do you close the door when someone has a foot in it? And that is very much the problem we know. And many of these discussions, remarks he has told us about it. But I would say money talks. And what we have seen in Europe is that money talks quite a lot. A number of years ago, we had a number of French think tanks, for example, who were infected and infiltrated by Russian money. That has more or less gone today, and you hear Macron takes the lead. We have the oligarchs. We have the oligarchs financing candidates who operate politics in the European Parliament and in the American Congress. I won't name any names, but they have been financed and they have been able to operate their political agenda through Russian capital. And when they are elected, they are able to get financed by ordinary means. Follow the money and transparency. If I look to the tradition in the UK and also here in the US, in the Anglo-Saxon political life, transparency is much less than on the European continent. And if you look, for example, at the libel clauses, you cannot publish books in UK about oligarchs without being forced to court. And all the oligarch money go in full-fledged to the courts, and you have to withdraw the books. If you publish them in Sweden, it's perfect, all right, no problems at all. There are no libel laws that protects oligarchs. And you have the same, to a certain extent, also in the US. So I would say transparency, change the legislation, make it easy for us to publish works and studies about those threats from I mean, you have mentioned them all.
Yeah.
It's not that difficult to see them and to watch them.
Thank you. Thank you for that thought. I want to say, I think we're in the middle of this story and not at the end of it, right? And so we all have a part to play in how this will end, and we appreciate so much your thoughtful research that helps us follow the right path. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for such thoughtful questions. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Mihara Pinta, Associate Professor and Chair of the Economics Department at the Green School. So it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Michael Camilleri. And while our two panels today focus on threats to democracy and countries experiencing democratic decline, Michael is going to bring a unique, I might want to say, optimistic perspective from his work at the US Agency for International Development. His focus is on places around the world where there are promising developments related to democracy. Economic disparities in societies spawn movements that challenge democratic institutions in nations around the world. USA Democracy Delivers initiative brings economic resources to those places so that government, civil society, and citizens can support and strengthen those democratic gains. So some of the questions that we had in the first panel, we have somebody that's going to be able to address those in terms of what US is doing in terms of economic development and aid. So until recently, Michael led USA Democracy Delivers initiative and was senior advisor in the office of USAID Administrator Samantha Power. This week, he was appointed acting assistant administrator of USAID Latin America and Caribbean Bureau. Michael, congratulations on your new role. FIU looks forward to working with you in your new capacity. Prior to that, Michael was executive director to USAID Northern Triangle Task Force and director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue. He served in the Obama-Biden administration as the Western Hemisphere advisor on the Secretary of State Policy Planning staff and as director for Andean Affairs at the National Security Council. Earlier in his career, he also worked as a human rights lawyer. Michael is with us today to discuss the relationship between economic development and democracy. He'll elaborate on why economic aid plays a vital role in supporting countries to navigate the challenges and opportunities that arise during periods of democratic transitions. Please welcome Michael Camilleri.
Thank you so much, Professor Pintia, for that very kind introduction. Don't worry, I have answers to all the questions that were raised by the first panel. Dean Dinar, thank you so much to you and your team here at the Green School for the invitation to address this topic of democracy and economic development at the Miami Conference on Global Democracy. USAID and FIU have been longstanding partners in advancing development objectives globally. Today here at FIU, as one of my very first acts in my new role leading our Latin American Caribbean Bureau, I'll be signing an extension of an MOU between USAID and the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center to foster collaboration, information exchange, and the professional development of FIU staff and students. So I'm really thrilled about that. It's really a particular privilege to be joining you in Miami for this important conversation that began with that excellent and thought-provoking panel this morning. Thank you, by the way, for calling on the U.S. Senate to confirm our ambassadors. I'll fully endorse that point of the conversation earlier today. So 2 years ago, my boss, USAID Administrator Samantha Power, was here on campus to sign the MOU that I'll be extending today. She described Miami as a gateway to the Americas, which is something we often hear, but also a gateway to America, a refuge from acts of God and acts of man for generations of exiles, particularly Latin American exiles who fled violent repression and armed conflict to pursue a life of dignity, safety, and opportunity here. They made Miami a living monument to the possibilities that democracy uniquely enables, a vivid reminder of the high price of authoritarianism. We don't have to look far in time or place for such reminders. For 50 years, this university here on campus has opened its doors to students whose families fled persecution. And just off campus sits St. Agatha Church, where Nicaraguan exiles gather on Sundays to hear Mass with Bishop Silvio Baez, one of the heroes of the fight for political and religious freedom in his home country, who himself left Nicaragua reluctantly in the face of threats to his life. So as I said, I'm honored to be here representing USAID, the world's premier international development agency. You have probably seen images of USAID professionals responding to natural disasters or delivering emergency food aid. You may be familiar with our efforts to combat HIV/AIDS and other diseases, to help farmers improve crop yields, to better children's learning outcomes, and to facilitate private sector job growth. My colleague Fernando Kostic is here in the front row. He's been doing this hard work for many decades. I'm a relative newcomer to the crucial work that USAID does across the world. What may be less apparent or less obvious is why USAID as a development agency is so deeply invested in strengthening democracy. The short answer is that democratic political systems, however imperfect and messy they may be, are the best way to achieve peace, prosperity, and sustainable development. Now, here in the United States, hopefully, our belief in democracy is a matter of conviction. Democratic systems have intrinsic value derived from their superiority in upholding human rights and justice, respecting individual dignity, enhancing equality and inclusion, and allowing freedom to flourish. In his first year in office, President Biden held a global summit for democracy to galvanize the forces of democratic renewal because, as the president put it, as a global community for democracy, we have to stand up for the values that unite us. But democracies also have instrumental value as a means to deliver human, economic, and environmental security benefits to citizens and communities. Despite authoritarian claims to the contrary, democracies are uniquely capable of generating the conditions that allow every member of society to thrive and contribute to sustainable growth and prosperity. USAID prides itself on being data-driven, and we have strong empirical evidence to back up these claims. Evidence shows, for example, that democracies are better for economic development. Since 1800, average GDP growth per capita has been higher in democracies than in autocracies. And between 1960 and 2010, countries that democratized increased their GDP per capita by about 20% over autocracies in the 25 years following democratization. This research, published by Darren Asamoglu and colleagues in 2019, concludes that, quote, democracy does cause growth and its effect is significant and sizable. Conversely, research based on VDEM data demonstrates that autocracies are more likely to experience economic crises. Here in Miami, again, we don't have to look too far for examples. Consider, for example, the 7.7 million Venezuelans who have fled repression and economic collapse since 2017. People who've had to leave their homes, their families, their communities to pursue what democracy makes possible: agency, safety, dignity. Evidence also shows that democracies deliver public goods and services to their citizens. Research has demonstrated that in aggregate, democracies do a better job than autocracies in providing goods like education, electricity, and healthcare. They also tend to spend more on social protection and have more effective climate policies than do autocracies. As a result, residents in democracies tend to experience better health outcomes in the form of longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality rates, and fewer deaths from non-communicable diseases. So for an international development agency like USAID, these are powerful insights. They buttress the intrinsic case for democracy with a robust evidence case. They belie the authoritarian narrative that top-down, command and control authoritarian systems are more efficient at delivering for citizens. And they demonstrate that democracy and sustainable development are integrally linked. So you might be asking, if the evidence shows that more democracy means more development, what are we doing about it? Support for democracy, human rights, and governance at USAID is not anything new. We are the leading provider of democracy assistance in the world. However, the sobering democratic trajectory that was mentioned this morning, of 2 decades almost of declining global freedom, requires us all, as the panelists suggested earlier, to critically examine our efforts. In the past couple of years, we at USAID have taken steps to deepen and to some degree rethink our democracy work, turning our focus to new and crucial fronts in the fight to strengthen democracy. Perhaps most notably, we are examining how all our development programs can support democracy, rights, and governance outcomes in at least 2 fundamental ways. First, our development assistance, ranging from health to climate change to economic growth, will take into consideration how programs can facilitate democratic progress in a country. USAID missions will examine how their entire assistance portfolio can contribute to democratic development by explicitly and deliberately considering democratic principles and practices in the program design and implementation process, using, for example, political economy analysis to identify stakeholders and existing power dynamics and to ensure that assistance maximizes accountable and democratic governance. Second, we regard all economic programming that respects democratic norms as a form of democracy assistance. When we help democratic leaders inclusively and accountably address key development needs of their constituents, whether that's bringing down inflation, lowering food prices, or reopening markets after a natural disaster, we are demonstrating in a way that a free press or a vibrant civil society cannot always do, that democracy delivers. As Zambian President Hichilema put it, you cannot eat democracy. So this conviction that democracy succeeds not just by protecting fundamental freedoms, but by making people's everyday lives better, led Administrator Samantha Power to conceive USAID's Democracy Delivers initiative, which, as was mentioned, I had the privilege of leading the past 15 months. This initiative embodies and operationalizes the nexus between democracy and development. So to give you a sense of what inspired Democracy Delivers, consider 2 countries. In one country, an authoritarian leader came to power in a coup d'etat and ruled by force for over 23 years. Citizens, inspired by an act of defiance from a simple fruit vendor and outraged by corruption and economic stagnation, rose up en masse and overthrew the dictator, triggering similar revolutions in neighboring countries. The country transitioned to democracy, held free and fair elections, expanded protections of human rights. But under democratic rule, economic growth slowed. The national debt ballooned. Unemployment rose to 18%. Economic crisis and a global pandemic provided the pretext for a populist president to consolidate power. And a decade after overthrowing authoritarian rule, the country's democratic experiment hangs in the balance. Now consider a second country, which has been battling grand and petty corruption since independence from the Soviet Union 30 years ago. In this country, Russia-aligned oligarchs masterminded the theft of 12% of the country's GDP from the country's banks. People took to the streets a few years later, demanding accountability and justice for the complicit. A new president was elected as a result, pledging a democratic European future for her country. She took on the oligarchs and stood up to Russian aggression in Ukraine. Russia responded by cutting energy supplies and inputs of products vital to the country's economy. The economy suffered, citizens' energy bills multiplied. The president even denounced a Russian-backed coup plot. But with support from USAID and our European partners, her government quickly identified alternative sources for gas imports, opened new markets for its agricultural commodities, made its market more attractive to foreign investors. And today, the country is largely independent of Russian gas, an official candidate for EU membership, and the leading plum exporter in the Northern Hemisphere. So the first country, as you probably guessed, is Tunisia. Any guesses on the second? Very good. Moldova. Moldova is the second country. Now, these descriptions are necessarily simplified, but they illustrate vividly the challenge that inspired our Democracy Delivers initiative. I think the term used this morning was performance legitimacy crisis, which I like. Unless reformers solidify their democratic and economic gains quickly, populations understandably grow impatient, especially if they feel that the risks they took to upend the old order have not yet yielded reforms that are positively impacting their own lives. Such discontent allows opponents of democratic rule, often aided by external autocratic regimes, to wrest back control, reversing reforms, and snuffing out dreams of rights regarding self-government. So the Democracy Delivers initiative aims to tilt the balance in democracy's favor by surging support, resources, and attention to countries at precisely the moment when the stakes are highest, when they are experiencing a promising but fragile moment of democratic opportunity. And nowhere is that task more important than in societies that have managed to elect democratic reformers or throw off autocratic or anti-democratic rule through peaceful protests or successful political movements. We hear a lot, as we did this morning, perhaps too much, about democratic backsliding and declining global freedom. We need to tackle that challenge, and we are. But we can't lose sight of the places where good things are happening, these so-called bright spots of democracy where citizen activism or a twist of fate has created an opening for a more democratic future. So with Democracy Delivers, we are harnessing the resources and relationships of USAID to help reformers in these bright spots deliver with agility, with visibility, with transparency on citizen priorities. Because we know from experience that for reformers to maintain the public support necessary to solidify democratic progress, they must show results on the pocketbook issues: jobs, food security, electricity prices, safe streets. So I'll give you an example of how we're doing this. In Tanzania, President Samia Suluhu Hassan came to office in 2021 after the sudden death of her autocratic predecessor and quickly took some important steps to signal greater democratic space in her country. Early in her tenure, she made maternal health a signature issue, and she learned about M-Mama, an emergency transport and referral system, kind of an Uber for expectant mothers that USAID had rolled out in partnership with the Vodafone Foundation. Now, this program provides a 24/7 toll-free number that connects to an app used by a nurse dispatcher to triage women and newborns, identify an appropriate health referral site, and then facilitate emergency transport, whether that's an ambulance or an identified community driver, and then facilitates payment of those community drivers. President Hassan, Tanzania's first woman president, learned that M-Mama had been rolled out in a particular district of Tanzania and had reduced maternal mortality by 38%. She came to us and said, I want to take this nationwide. We said, that's great. Yeah, we'll scale it nationwide. She said, I want to do it in a year. We said, okay, we'll do it in a year. And we were able to do it in the next 12 months, saving thousands of lives in the process. We are now working with Vodafone and other partners to expand M-Mama beyond Tanzania, Lesotho, Kenya, Malawi, and beyond. And importantly, M-Mama works with and through local governments' health systems. So after a 5-year period, the national government fully assumes and sustains the cost of the program, ultimately strengthening public service delivery in the country. In addition to Tanzania and Moldova, which I've mentioned, Democracy Delivers is currently focused on supporting Armenia, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Malawi, the Maldives, Nepal, and Zambia. This is not a static list, of course. We understand bright spots, democratic openings, they open, sometimes they close. We're currently looking at a couple of exciting new potential bright spots, including one here in our hemisphere. So across these countries, we are working to expand USAID's impact in critical sectors. But we're also doing much more by leveraging our convening power and our diplomatic tools. This might include brokering a meeting between a country's president and the CEO of a major American company to discuss potential investment. It might include helping a government negotiate its way out of a sovereign debt default so it can increase spending on social services. Or it could include mobilizing, as we did at the UN General Assembly last year, over $100 million from philanthropic entities to support Democracy Delivers countries and goals. The emphasis on improving economic opportunity and service delivery is no accident, nor is the emphasis on partnerships with business, foundations, and other donors. We are convinced that helping democracies deliver cannot be the work of one government or even of governments alone. Corporations looking for rules respecting investment climates, public and private donors looking to maximize their development impact, even citizens choosing their next vacation spot can all benefit from applying a democratic bright spots lens to their decisions. You might think I'm exaggerating, but in Nepal, we just ran a tourism campaign with Instagram influencers that actually incorporated Democracy Delivers themes. So Democracy Delivers as an initiative is less than 2 years old. We are moving fast. We're learning as we go. We're asking lots of questions. How long do democratic openings last? What makes them most likely to succeed? What kinds of support are most effective and on what timeline? Since we're here at FIU, Dean, I would invite the academic community to help us answer some of these questions. We are convinced, though, that while Democracy Delivers as an initiative, like democracy itself, is a work in progress, we must update our democratic playbook for a world in which democracy is not just under threat, but under attack. And it is essential we develop the tools to surge support quickly and impactfully to democratic bright spots when and wherever they emerge. Democracy Delivers is one crucial way in which we are responding to President Biden's call for democratic renewal, breaking down the barriers between development assistance and democracy assistance, and acting on the compelling body of evidence that expanding democracy globally will advance human dignity and accelerate our development impact. And we would, of course, welcome you all as partners in that effort. Thank you very much. I think I'm open to some questions. So make them easy, and please introduce yourselves if you can. Yeah, please.
Very interesting that we're focusing on democratic principles in countries. Yet, as someone mentioned in the first panel, that you don't focus inwardly
towards the complacency of our country, where almost half, if not more than half, of the country is marching towards an authoritarian regime, controlled by a person who pretty much doesn't know anything about government, civics, political structures, and as we've seen over the past few days, has no respect for the judicial system. And I'm wondering what measures could be undertaken by us as American citizens to kind of shake the complacency out of this country, because I think we just take our democratic values for granted. And I am personally so gravely concerned that we're moving in the wrong direction. And I'm curious to hear your comments on that.
Thanks. That's not an easy one. You're gonna get me into trouble by getting me into domestic politics, but let me try to find an elegant way to be responsive. No, it's a perfectly fair and perceptive question. I'll say maybe three things. And on the complacency point, I actually would quibble a little bit with the with the assessment that we heard this morning. We probably are too complacent, but I would argue we're much less complacent than we were, say, a decade ago. I think just the experience of seeing foreign electoral interference well documented in our own election, and then obviously what happened around the 2020 election. I think we are, if nothing else, having these debates as a society in a way that we weren't a decade ago, and so we'd be interested to just hear. I'm sure there are diverse views on that, and the sense of urgency I would associate myself with, but I do think that maybe for some unfortunate reasons we are more awake to these challenges today than we were in the recent past. The second thing I'd mention is just that the President Biden, has approached the global conversation with a very explicit sense of humility about our own challenges as a democracy, and just the sense that democracy is not a destination, right? It's this thing that we've got to. I think President Reagan said this back in the day. It's this thing that every generation kind of has to define and redefine and fight for. And again, I think we're attuned to that maybe in a way that we're beginning to take for granted. And so when he convened that global summit for democracy in his first year, as he had promised, it was very much not with an intention to lecture to anybody or propose that we have all the answers, but rather to say we need to come together around a set of values and learn from each other and support each other, given the kinds of threats both from within and from without that all our democracies are coming up against. And then the final thing I'll say is that this democracy delivers kind of model, I think, takes some inspiration also from what we've seen domestically, which is that a sense of again that democracy, I think one of the people who asked a question this morning spoke about kind of the disconnect between I go to the ballot box, I place my vote, but how does that connect to my everyday kind of lived experience, and needing to sort of close that gap, and President Biden has spoken about that in various ways domestically, and we take some inspiration from that, I think, in how we approach the work of strengthening democracy globally, alongside all of the critical work that USA does and will continue to do in supporting civil society, supporting independent media, supporting free and fair elections. Those building blocks, continue to be absolutely critical, but they can't come at the expense of, perhaps what we've done in the past, which is take for granted that people need to see the impact in their own everyday lived experience. Thanks. Yeah.
It's okay. It's really more of a sort of an addition to your not wanting to talk about politics.
Please, you can talk about it all you want.
Well, okay. So my phone, I mean, in a piece of good news, the way I see it, my phone just told me that the House is going to press ahead with the vote on Ukraine and Israel. To me, I'm sorry, I'm old enough to remember when Johnson did a total flip against his party of all those years and got the Civil Rights Act passed. This, to me, is the same kind of action. Mike Johnson is, I don't know what he's doing, totally unpredictable. So I just wanted to deliver that good piece of news. To me, that's good news, that politics is, like, statesmanship is more important. Democracy may be more important than his personal gain. That's my comment for the moment.
Well said. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I just want to follow up on a question that was said earlier from the panel on offense. And it sounds like U.S. aid is being offensive and has a strategy to be offensive. But what I do see that's missing is promotion and marketing of it. Due to some studies that were referenced earlier in the day, the majority of the people, at least from the grassroots, believe that others are achieving and are successful, while your achievements are not being at least observed coming from the U.S. government. Additionally, the majority of your workers overseas, I also believe that there's a lack of marketing and information domestically as the successes that you're doing overseas and why democracy is important. And additionally, the words that were used, what was it, sharp power. Uh, we don't see it as a threat here domestically, while everyone overseas understands the immediate threat. So I believe that there seems to be a disconnect between your hard work, your agency's hard work, and the marketing and promotion of it.
Yeah, great question. I was thinking the same thing actually as I heard the conversation earlier. I think look, our agency is led by a former journalist, and so I think she would probably associate herself with the sense that like we need to do a better job telling our story, and I think we are, but there's a long way to go in doing that. Part of this is about our model, right? You know, we're not gonna do propaganda. We're not gonna create news outlets in Latin America or like I think RC in Espanol was mentioned like as an like we're not going to do that, right? That's not our democratic model. We're also not going to go in and build like big stadiums and major kind of infrastructure projects that are more frankly for show and for marketing purposes and to put a big Chinese flag on the side of them than they are for actually advancing the development of the people in the country. But that the fact that we are rigorous in the way we think about development and democratic in the way that we think about sharing information may create some challenge. So we're not going to compete like for like, but we do need to compete. And so I think I would just associate myself and I think Fernando, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this with the sense that I think there's an awareness that that we have a marketing problem essentially, and that we need to do better in conveying, the generosity of the American people and the good that we're doing around the world. I do think that we are beginning to see, I think, in some places, kind of buyer's remorse on the PRC model in particular, and how predatory it is in places where, whether it's a dam in Ecuador or a debt crisis in Sri Lanka, the countries that have kind of come all the way around on, the big promises and the big checks and like what comes kind of the morning after. And so that provides an opportunity to, again, to kind of reaffirm that our development model, which is based on grants, not loans, and things that make people's lives better rather than enriching a few government or private sector elites, that ultimately is the model that countries that are interested in actually providing opportunities and dignity for their people are more likely to want to pursue. And I think you begin to see that in some of the polling data, for example, on opinions regarding the United States relative to other countries. But that's not to deny that we feel a fierce sense of urgency about finding more effective ways to communicate the incredible impact that people like Fernando do around the world every day on behalf of the United States government and people.
I'm International Business. I also run the Center for International Business Education Research at FIU. So as a professor of international business global strategy, one of the challenges which we face, and as I look at it, is that the ecosystem in the United States is very much not working in unison. And where I'm coming from is the role of multinationals. So when I look at the multinationals making investments, and I heard a report from Nicholas Burns, the ambassador of China, of the United States China, that despite the tension between US and China, the investments by the US multinationals in China is increasing. And clearly, in terms of the USAID, World Bank, American Development Bank, Exim Bank, different banks are trying to promote, US interest in many parts of the world. And yet multinationals in the United States, they are very much focused on their bottom line, how to expand business in China and other countries which are not basically look very favorably, or the geopolitical tension between the United States and China. So how do you reconcile this, this different messages, because on the one hand, clearly we would like to see a growth of democracy, democratic values. I come from India, which stands for those values, but I want to make sure that we are on the same page. And multinationals have been given a free ride. the US multinationals are doing business, so well in China that basically they have ignored the foreign policy. In many ways, I was reminded by a Harvard Business Review article by Robert Reich. He talked about in the early 1990s, who is us and who is them. And so where should we be focusing our efforts? Should we promote US multinationals because they are making money in different parts of the world? Or should we be focusing on countries or multinationals which are basically espousing for democratic values? Thank you.
Is your question in reference to U.S. corporations or yeah? Yeah. I won't claim to be an expert on this issue, and so others in the room would probably have more more detailed and nuanced views. I think I think the reflection that I would offer is one that came up this morning, which is, and it's similar in some ways to what we face in the media space, which is like our model is an open one, right? So we're not built to tell U.S. businesses, broadly speaking, where they should be investing, what they should be investing in. It's not. It's very different than what we see with PRC banks, for example, and where they're where they're lending money and what they're lending money for. We don't. That's not the way we don't tell Citibank where to place a loan. Now we place some limits, right? We have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, right? So there are examples where we have placed parameters consistent with our own democratic model and our national interests around the way that U.S. companies operate abroad. But this is one of those areas that I think that the speakers spoke to on the first panel, where getting getting to the right place between the wide open door and the closed door is just going to require, I think, people that are much smarter than me thinking about how we get that balance, how we adapt that balance, I suppose, to the world that we face today versus the world that we might have faced 30 years ago. If folks want to jump in on this, who've thought about it, please do. Yeah.
Larry, thank you for being here today and for your continued support to FIU. My name is Besiki Kutatelaze. I'm a criminology professor here. We are about 600 miles away from islet of Hispaniola. And between 8 and 10% of FIU students actually speak Haitian Creole. So Haiti is very close to our heart. I must confess, I worked there for MINUSTA with the UN between 2008 and 2012. And then times were difficult then, but in some ways better than they are now. What is your agency currently doing there? And more importantly, what is a plan from the administration standpoint? When can we get involved with our support? Mm-hmm. And what would be the ideal scenario in Haiti in a couple of years from now, where we meet everyday Haitians here, students and our neighbors who tell us they simply cannot go home. There are significant security concerns. And hopefully you can speak to this issue because many of our students will care. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a great question, and probably the issue that I'm now spending the greatest portion of my time on as I transition to lead our Latin American Caribbean Bureau. And I can tell you is occupying a lot of time for our partners at the White House and across the interagency. So first point is the U.S. government is seized with this challenge and the really difficult situation confronting the people of Haiti. You asked, I think, 3 questions. What are we doing? What's the plan? What's the ideal scenario in 2 years? So let me try to answer those 3 specific questions. What is USA doing currently in Haiti? We have big programs in a few areas. The biggest is in health. Second biggest, I think, is agriculture. We're also working on democratic governance and citizen security. So a pretty broad portfolio. And the good news is, as well as a large humanitarian portfolio now with about, I think, 1.65 million people in the country facing kind of a critical level of food insecurity. So we are the major donor behind all of that humanitarian relief. The good news, if there is a piece of good news, is that we are still able to reach most of the people that we are trying to reach with that assistance. Obviously, most of that is outside Port-au-Prince. Within the city, it's within the capital. It's obviously more challenging, but at this point, we have the ability, for the most part, through our partners, to reach the people who are most vulnerable. So that's what we're doing now. What's the plan? The plan essentially has two components, which you know well, which is to stand up, as we have this week, a transitional presidential council, and to deploy a multinational security support mission led by the police force from Kenya, but with contributions of other countries, to try to A, stabilize the political situation in the country, and B, stabilize the security situation in the country. And then, what are we hoping in 2 years is to get Haiti to a point where you can actually hold free and fair elections, and once again have an elected representative government that can take the country forward with continued support from the international community. So all of those things need to come together amidst enormous challenges involving gang violence and other critical challenges that you're aware of. But there is, I think the good news is there's a roadmap that the international community and CARICOM and Haitian leaders have coalesced around. So we just need to move forward and execute that roadmap. I'm sure there'll be bumps in the road, but I think there is a way forward. It's a good question. I'm going to punt on that because I'm hoping to come back to Miami and actually meet with the Haitian diaspora, and I've only had sort of one opportunity to do that so far, having just moved into this role. This is another area, just broadly speaking, I think diaspora engagement is an area where we feel we can be doing a lot more. Administrator Power is actually meeting this week with both Moldovan and Armenian diaspora in Washington. I believe she's met with the Haitian diaspora in the past, but I think there's a sense of like there's more to be done, more to be leveraged, more talent and insight and investment to be gleaned from. I mean, Miami is sort of a living testament to this, right? To the power of diaspora communities. So I would love to chat with you after if you have specific ideas on that. A question in the back.
My name is Derek. I'm from Department of Public Policy. I just want to add something based on that question. I didn't want to ask, but looking at what you said, Kenya is trying one way or the other to support the country. But here's the case that we know, per the Freedom House data, that Kenya itself is not even free. So how do we use a country that in itself is not even free to help support another country that is absolutely failed and devastated? Do you think the US have, a preconceived idea that we don't know? And what is your agency trying to do? Because even look at the African continent, the Freedom House, it's only Ghana and South Africa that's totally free. And why is that the USCI or your agency is not even using such countries to help, Haiti, but Kenya?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I'll give you a realist answer, and I'll give you maybe a more optimistic answer. I mean, I think the reality is that not every country wants to step forward to do the hard work that needs to be done. So that's the first thing I think we just have to recognize. This is not the most appealing mission, right? To go into a country that's been, to some extent overrun by gangs, where there's not really a functioning government, where there's, let's say, a checkered and mixed history of international involvement and intervention. And so the fact that President Ruto has stepped up is to be commended, and because he's doing it when a lot of others haven't. Now, the concern that I would even make the concern you're expressing more specific, which is what do we know about the Kenyan police and their record and how, what does that tell us about the way they might operate in Haiti? And again, there's some specific concerns and lessons learned from past experience, and the concerns you're raising are on point and legitimate. And so, as part of this deployment, there are parameters and standard operating procedures and human rights training, and directives and things in the way that as well as accountability mechanisms that need to be put in place so that whether it was the Kenyan police or any other, frankly, but all the more so if some of the concerns you're mentioning are present, to ensure that we have the kinds of guarantees in place as this foreign force comes in and assumes part of the security burden within Haiti. So that's an imperfect answer, I accept. And again, it's a fair question, but people are, I think, thinking very hard about this and trying to put in place as much of a kind of infrastructure as possible to ensure that the individuals who do deploy as part of this mission are held to a high standard of conduct. You can ask the easy question.
I just want to ask another a student-focused question. Obviously, we have a lot of students in the audience. For those students interested in economic development, democracy, in this particular area, obviously there's USAID as a career path, as an internship path. What are some other career and internship paths available to students who want to work in this particular space?
Great. Within the government, the obvious one is the State Department, which has a Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau, and all our embassies abroad have democracy and human rights officers, and so that's a civil service track as well as a foreign service track. I'm a huge fan of the PMF program that students, the graduate students, should all, if you're at all interested in the work, you should look at that. I'm happy to like talk your ear off about it when we're done here. My team has a great Nepali American, actually, PMF, the team that I'm coming from, who's just done extraordinary work for us. So that's within the government. I think that's the obvious one. I've had the fortune of actually moving between government, think tank, civil society, even a little bit of private sector when I can get away with it. I think there's great value actually in all of those sectors and amazing work to be done. So I feel extremely fortunate to be able to do public service and serve now twice in a U.S. administration. And there's no greater satisfaction and at least in my experience than being able to serve your country in ways that are impactful and do good around the world. But when I was working as a human rights lawyer or working in a think tank on democracy and rule of law issues, convening folks and proposing solutions and trying to be the intellectual ballast for all of the busy government people like Fernando who are too busy, dealing with their inboxes and the crises to think deeply about challenges. A lot of the work that you all do in academia as well. So I would just say, think broadly about the opportunities that exist, because there's really interesting work to be done, I think, across the board. The final thing I'll mention actually is just I think the U.S. Congress is still like for all its all its challenges, can be a really interesting place to, particularly for a young professional, to get to know how policy is made. I never did it, and I regret not doing so, because everybody I've ever worked with who had that experience, I think benefits from it in terms of understanding how the kind of policy process is made. And you can do some, I think some member offices, including, some of the ones from this area, take very seriously the issues with authoritarianism, particularly in Latin America, and have just been like dogged champions. Sometimes, frankly, to our, they're a little tough on us, but that's okay, because they're doing it for the right reasons, which is that we're wanting to champion and advance our democratic values in this hemisphere and around the world. All right, thanks so much. Thank you.
Folks, we're going to reconvene at 2 p.m. for our last panel in room 102. So back to the previous room. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Sasha Restifo, the Bhagavan Mahavir Assistant Professor in Jain Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at the Green School, and I have the honor of introducing our second panel. My being asked to introduce this panel is a bit ironic, as the key principle of Jainism, the religion that I study, is ahimsa, which we often translate as no harm. And of course, that's quite the opposite of what this panel will be discussing. Committing ourselves to free and fair practices is essential to a democratic society. So what happens when the pillars of democracy are eroded by corruption, electoral distortion, disinformation, suppression of civil liberties, or restriction of the media? This panel will explore the specific tactics governments use to wear down democracy and to suppress people's ability to express dissent, often in the name of security. Before I introduce the panel moderator, I'd like to thank Ajay Diamico, Director of the Media and Democracy Program at the Knight Foundation. Ajay assisted us in securing one of the panelists. Thank you so much. Now, our moderator is Milena Nishkova, Associate Professor of Public Policy Administration and Faculty Coordinator for the Green School's Master of Arts in Global Affairs. Milena, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm honored to serve as moderator of a panel discussion on an issue that is impacting many nations, including our own. It is a pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. We have here Dr. Inga Traufi, Head of Research of the Propaganda Research Lab at the University of Texas, Austin. We have Adrian Shabazz, Vice President of Research and Analysis at the Freedom House. Next is Dr. Tatiana Kostadinova, Professor in the FIU Department of Politics and International Relations. And last but not least, Dr. Besiki Kototeladze.
No one would know.
But I got it. Associate Professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Before we delve into the specific tactics, let me start off this panel discussion by addressing the causes that led to democratic backsliding we are witnessing around the globe. Dr. Kostadinova, I'll start with you. Based on your research, what are some of the causal factors for democratic erosion experienced by countries around the world? Also, what are the consequences? How is democratic backsliding damaging? Also, if you could speak, please, about a few of various forms of backsliding that we
Thank you very much to be here with you today. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some thoughts that are based on my research and also on the work of many scholars who today study a very complex development. We have known historically that there were countries that would, after their attempt to democratize, they would go back to authoritarianism that we used to call reverse wave for countries that go back to the practices that they used before they even tried to become democratic. But these countries have never been so many as the number that we consider today as cases of democratic backsliding shows. So there is also something else. We talk today about modern type of de-democratization, modern type of backsliding. It has its characteristic features that I hope we will be able to at least point at a few of them. I would like to talk about this phenomenon defined briefly as incremental democratic erosion, erosion of institutions, of rules and norms that results from the actions of duly elected governments. Now, I put the emphasis on a few of the concepts that are included in this definition, and I had something in mind when I did that. So turning to a few only of the causes, because there are really too many factors that help foster some democratic backsliding to take place. I would like to start with what we see usually preceding a country that a process that started and ended with democratic backsliding is some high degree of social and political polarization in a country. This polarization produces disappointment, disagreement about this among the citizens, and then it translates into lack of trust in democratic institutions. All this leads to higher risks of anti-system players, anti-system parties, and anti-system individuals who have authoritarian tendencies to come to power. Another important development is the rise of populism. Another phenomenon that is not new. However, in modern times, we see another rise of globalism, populism globally. Why is populism a factor that would lead to democratic backsliding? Mostly because in many instances, populist movements and parties that win elections are headed by charismatic individuals who are very authoritarian in nature. And they start to exploit the process, the very process that we consider as the basis, the fundamentals of a democracy, the electoral process. Pay attention here. They come to power through elections, and elections, according to everybody who promotes democratic government, elections are at the heart of a democratic political system. So this makes the modern types of backsliding look kind of different from previous cases of turning back to authoritarianism. In the past, we would associate such developments with classic coup d'etats or very dramatic, radical movements, shifts, sometimes very violent. Something along the lines of what we saw in Chile in 1973. Well, now in our times, what happens is there is a gradual erosion. That's why I started. This is an incremental erosion that is happening. And that is why it's hard to detect from the very beginning. It happens through the electoral process, through the democratic process in a country. And it happens slowly, doesn't start immediately after an authoritarian-minded leader comes to power. So this is one of the, a paradox here, that populists come to power through elections. And this electoral road to a breakdown is what some scholars have called is dangerously deceptive, because if it is through elections. Another important factor would be whether would-be autocrats can capture the executive branch. Because sometimes these parties win a representation in national assemblies, in legislatures. But the important thing is whether they are able to capture the executive, the prime ministerial position or the presidential position. And they do. In many instances, they do. So what follows after that is a process of concentration of power, consolidation of power at the center. And this executive aggrandizement is another characteristic feature that leads to further democratic backsliding afterwards. Why? Because what happens is by concentrating more power at the center and the executive, the legislatures are weakened and the institutions of democratic accountability are also weakened. The controls, right? The institutions that we usually think of as guardians of the democratic process. And I would like to mention just a couple of the consequences that I think are very damaging and broadly considered and recognized to be damaging. One is from a strategic point of view. In order to stay in power and continue with the backsliding and movement towards an authoritarian government, that happens if an authoritarian leader comes to power, is through electoral manipulation. So they come to power under the current electoral rules, but then what happens is they actions aimed at tilting the electoral playing field in favor of the incumbents. And this can happen through changes in the electoral law. It can happen through hampering media access, through using government funds by the incumbents, while at the same time opposition parties are deprived of access to any type of government state money where there is a law, of course, allowing for that. There is also a packing of electoral commissions with people loyal to the regime. This kind of occurs long before the election day. This is also interesting. That is not only on election day when international observers would come and see. No, so many things happen before, so that on election day, most things appear okay. But actually, the process had started to erode and to damage the political process long before that. And one more important damaging effect is the increase of corruption. And this is another paradox. Most of these governments come to power running on a platform to fight corruption, to combat corruption. This is how they win election, because they promise the people to save them from the corrupt, evil elites. But what happens afterwards, once they come to power, they start to develop huge, broad, clientelistic types of networks that are based on client-patron relationships, based on loyalty to the leader, and exchanges of gifts, of different resources by targeting only the loyal to the regime members, citizens of in a political space. So populists claim they will fight corruption and save the people. They would bring more democracy. This is what they claim. They have been elected, so whatever changes they make, they look like being made by an elected official. That's the deception. At the end of the day, however, the democratic institutions are weakened. I'll stop here.
Thank you. So, we already started talking about some of the mechanisms through which backsliding is happening. My next question is for Adrian. I'll go by first name. Is there a common playbook that would be authoritarian follow in undermining democracy?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Milena, for hosting this panel and convening us. To Dean Dinar and to the Green School, this is really a fantastic convening in a beautiful setting here. I also want to give a shout out to a few of our trustees who are in the audience, Felix Maradiaga and Carol Corcoran, who are great supporters of Freedom House. And Freedom House is so proud to be a co-sponsor of what is a really important conference today. I think that was really a masterclass in democratic backsliding, which makes your students are very lucky here at FIU. If maybe there's three things that I can point to, because there really is this authoritarian playbook. Many of them share common tactics around how, once elected into power, they take control of the states in order to prevent them from being held accountable for the inevitable abuses and corruptions that take place. So those three, if I could break it down into maybe three groups, one of them is around dividing the public. So this gets to what we heard even in the earlier panel around the role that propaganda, that sort of anti-pluralism plays in the rhetoric of these would-be autocrats, is that they're oftentimes deeply illiberal in that they scapegoat immigrants, members of the LGBTQ community, different ethnic or religious minorities as being responsible for all of the country's problems. They increase polarization quite deliberately through their rhetoric to make it an us versus them. And they paint people, usually these scapegoats or oftentimes the critics of their own corrupt practices, as enemies of the people, enemies of the state. And this is all part of a tactic of dehumanizing the opposition or who they see as the opposition in a country to then legitimize repression against them, almost as if they are not, let's say, deserving of democratic rights. So it is this rhetoric which paves the way for then the stripping of democratic rights against certain populations in a country. So that would be step one. Step two is then around capturing institutions. And so here, I think the most important thing that we see is around the media. The media being the key vehicle for disseminating a message, informing the public, winning, and it's critical in election periods. And so what we see in many of these backsliding democracies is that there is a concerted effort, whether it is through laws, whether it is through advertising and financing. Oftentimes it's through these cronyists who are close to the president, so business interests that then go in and buy up all of the opposition media, so that these independent medias that had been struggling in many countries financially are then bought out, oftentimes against their will, to by people who are very close to the president or the prime minister. And once they have control over the media, they can control the message. So there is very little way to, for the average citizen to pick up a newspaper, turn on the television, and see something that is actually critical of the government. Instead, the media becomes this propaganda mouthpiece, not only for how good the government is doing, but then also for spewing this type of polarizing rhetoric that I referenced earlier. The third tactic then, and the final one, I mean, there's so many, but is then changing the rules. So once they have they have this incredibly polarizing rhetoric. They have then captured the media, oftentimes even the industrial base of a country, the business interest. They use all of that to win elections, to win a supermajority. And then once in power, they use, again, as Tatiana mentioned, democratic means, legal means, to just change the rules in their favor. So that's where it can be this type of, let's say, less perceptive way of undermining democracy, because it is not about just all of a sudden declaring martial law. I mean, it can be in certain places. But oftentimes it is this slow process of winning elections and then saying, well, we actually have a majority in parliament. They oftentimes got it through very corrupt or deceptive means. And then once they're in power, I mean, Viktor Orban in Hungary changed the constitution over a dozen times. And the electoral laws, right? You have Bukele in El Salvador, who worked with the judiciary, essentially remade the judiciary to put his own people into power, so that the constitutional court would rule in a way that, that he was allowed to run for office again. And we see that time and time again, where the presidents or the prime ministers, whoever is in power, once they've captured institutions, then there's no check on their authority. And so that's when really, things can get kind of crazy at that point, right? Because there's nobody who is allowed to express opposition to and you don't hear it anywhere. And that's where, when you combine all of these factors, and this is what we see in places like Turkey, in Hungary, in India, many other of these backsliding democracies, where there is just this step-by-step process where they take their time. They're very, very patient in terms of building up a movement, of building up the ideological base to win this battle of ideas. And then once they have won that, it's just easy sailing to then use the democratic institutions in a way that is just to pursue their own interests.
Yes, thank you. Now, you started talking about the media. As a former journalist, I can attest to the the truth to what you just said. But now the social media, the emerging technologies, they open new venues for authoritarian leaders to use misinformation and propaganda. My next question is for Inga. How do authoritarian leaders in power and those that are aspiring to be in power use social media for propaganda, for misinformation, and to further their own benefits? And also, are there any new trends thinking about new technologies as AIs or more traditional social media as TikTok?
Yeah, a very big question. But the first two panelists set the stage so perfectly. I also wanted to say thank you being here. It's a privilege to join the panel, to be part of the Green School community for a day, I consider myself. And a special thank you to the Knight Foundation, who's been such a valuable supporter of all the work we've done at the Center for Media Engagement for the last years. So I'm going to drill in a bit more into the details of these authoritarian playbooks, because thankfully the background has been provided so extensively, and really talk about social media. So the short answer is social media is normalized now as a tool for manipulating public opinion, spreading propaganda, and controlling speech for aspiring autocrats or for autocrats. And if we take a step back, then that's a seismic shift, right? 10, 15 years ago, it was coined a liberation technology, and now I usually attend discussions where it's how bad is it gonna be? And not is it gonna be good or bad in the end? So on that note, authoritarian or aspiring autocrats, they're both innovative and really clumsy in the way that they employ social media for their means. So they are innovative in a way that they do exploit emergent technologies, and they are hunting for new tools and new means of deception that they can incorporate into their toolkit. And one of these innovations that we've identified over the last couple of years, for instance, also employing encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp, Telegram, Viber into their propaganda social media toolkit, I would call it. And they have good reasons to do that. There's basically no platform moderation on these apps, so that's great for them. And then also these apps are often perceived as closer to the people, more trusted, not as polluted yet, so the propaganda there can potentially be more impactful. One of the examples of an aspiring autocrat, in my opinion, who has really excelled in building a WhatsApp propaganda ecosystem is Narendra Modi with his BJP in India. And I could talk for a really long time about the WhatsApp ecosystem that he built. I just spent a couple of weeks in India researching new trends and how things are playing up in the lead up to this election. But the bottom line for us right now is that he spearheaded this effort, him and his BJP, for over 10 years now, and opposition parties' movement there, if at all, only playing catch up. And it's, in my opinion, one of the most important variables in explaining Modi's domestic soft power success, almost, him being a prototypical, what we would call informational autocrat. So those are autocrats or aspiring autocrats who rule heavily through the manipulation of information, which manages to keep them popular while at the same time doing a lot of authoritative measures and actually cracking down. So that is definitely one. I also said earlier they're clumsy, right? So we shouldn't give them too much credit all the time. What everyone knows about bots on Twitter, now X, bot networks or sock puppet accounts on Facebook, and really clumsy stuff that also constantly happens on social media and is trying to be manipulated. But that is very often detected by external researchers, or sometimes the social media companies even take down an influence network or something. But I would argue that for many of those aspiring autocrats, that actually doesn't matter, or at least doesn't matter anymore, because they can rely on their huge toolkit of manipulating social media. So one takedown isn't really that big of a deal. And it ties into what has already been said. Obviously, in hand with all of this online social media manipulation, they intimidate and suppress journalists, for example, and independent researchers. So ideally, no one even reports on your embarrassing propaganda campaign, then you've really won. And that actually leads to another part where social media has played a huge role, and it is politically really important, but often kind of like brushed off, and that is like the trolling and harassment that is done by propagandists often affiliated to the government of minority communities, often of journalists, especially often of female journalists. Actually, like social media is a huge platform for trolling and harassment. While I said all of that, because I also just came back from India and actually had some encouraging conversation and insights as well, like I still want to underline that social media is a double-edged sword. Like it still has the potential of democratic organizing, for instance, if you can rely on the end-to-end encryption of some messaging apps. It's still, when I speak to folks in India who are still independent journalists, they're like, never ever, like, would I survive without social media? Like, this is how I can still put my stuff out there, because the traditional media is completely pro-Modi, for instance. So we are just at this point where we really need a revitalization or resuscitation of a space that was previously called a liberation technology, and that needs like cross-sector, cross-country like ideas and collaborations.
Thank you. Yes. Besides having an independent media, investigative journalists, the judiciary system is very important, usually the first target of authoritarian leaders. And of course, the importance of having independent judicial system cannot be overstated. Besiki, my colleague, you have such an extensive experience in working with the United Nations to promote the rule of law. Now you're studying judicial elections. So does having elected versus appointed judiciary and prosecutors help or hinder democracy? And to what extent does this make judicial branch more or less independent from other branches?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to FIU if you're not from here, and especially if you traveled long distances. Students, always wonderful to see you. You are the best. So, you know what I will try? I'll try to respond to your question relatively briefly, because I have a perfect case study from Georgia, the country of my origin and upbringing, that probably speaks to all of those issues right now, what you just described. So I do study prosecution. I do study courts. That's my area of research, and also the research projects that I'm managing as part of FIU. And every time I go to other countries and I have discussions about independent judiciary, including my own Georgia, there are proposals about possibly electing prosecutors and judges, as we do in the United States, to make the judiciary somehow independent from the other branches of government. And people often naively think that can be a solution, because, you know, if it works in the United States, why would it not work in a place like Georgia, for example? And then, you know, I have to give them reality check and tell what's really happening in that area, even in our own favorite state of Florida, where we have the governor who suspended 2 duly elected state attorneys, Andrew Warren in Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, and Monique Worrell in Orange Osceola, which is Orlando, because the governor didn't seem to agree with these duly elected state attorneys, who are the basically chief prosecutors in those counties, around the charging decision, which is completely nonsensical. Governors have no role to play in deciding how prosecutors exercise the discretion. So that's happening here. So the electing prosecutors or electing judges can be also dangerous, and that they don't also lead necessarily to judicial independence. Briefly, I want to switch to what's happening in Georgia, because I've been very much concerned about what I've been watching since Monday. Georgia, and when I say Georgia, and this audience understands that this is the country of Georgia as opposed to state, hence my accent and my last name. So since Monday, people have been on the streets in Georgia protesting against the government And you may have seen on CNN somebody punching somebody in the parliament in the face. So that's happening in my wonderful country. So what's happening there? Georgia's, the government has initiated a new law, very Russian-style foreign agent law, which requires reporters, civil society members, NGOs to register as basically foreign agents if they receive 20% of their funding from abroad. So, the law is proposed on the premise of transparency, but Georgians are just not buying it. And they're out in the streets protesting as we speak, tens of thousands of, especially youth, and I'm very proud of them. And Georgia wants to be part of the European Union. But you have to think about the geographical location. I mean, we are between Russia and Turkey. We're a couple of 100 miles away from Iran. It's a very tense, historically, very difficult area. 90% of Georgians support the joining European Union, which means that cutting the ties with Russia, because we've seen what those laws have done in Russia in terms of completely eliminating the dissent, right? Any opposition channels, etc. European Union gave Georgia candidacy status in December, largely because of those voices of the people. And
the West-oriented president.
Yeah. So Georgia is a parliamentary republic. So it has the prime minister that makes all the calls, but it also has the president.
Very outspoken.
Yeah, she's very outspoken. She's a former French diplomat who has been active in Georgia now for a couple of decades. And she has very close ties with the French president and the German chancellor, etc. He's out there. He's a staunch advocate for Georgia joining the European Union. But so then you would ask, why are they pushing for this law now? It sounds pretty crazy. You just got the candidacy status. You want to move to the next stage of EU membership negotiations. And there are multiple theories. One is really the controlling media, controlling NGOs. I mean, what distinguishes us from Russia is those critical voices that you do hear on the streets. We have several independent media channels. Civil society is very robust, largely due to the funding we've been receiving from the West. I mean, that's undeniable. And so as a parliamentary election is approaching in October in Georgia, they want to get rid of those people, kick them out of the country, reduce their ability to voice their concerns, etc., etc. That has worked in Russia. The playbook has been perfect there. Another, the reason why they're pushing for this really is to overcome some of the accusations of corruption that has been really mounting in the country against the prime minister, against the judiciary, going back to the judiciary. So our former prime minister who stepped down in January, this is part of the same Georgian Dream Party, just took his government plane and flew his son to University of Pennsylvania, where the son is a student. Ironic thing about this is all their children are coming to Europe and the United States to study, and they're keeping the Georgian kids just in Russia's backyard. So they took the airplane, and then Secretary Blinken announced sanctions against Georgian judges who control the judiciary. And so there was so much attention to this topic. There is a theory that the government is now pushing for this new law that will likely trigger this kind of response because they understand the sentiments. They pushed for the similar law last year, and they had to recall it because the people came out into the streets. So another, more important than the president is somebody called Ivanishvili, who is the head of the Dream Party, the richest man in Georgia, the Russian oligarch, who still has a very close ties with Russia. And the idea of Georgia now becoming possibly part of the European Union, realistically doesn't sit well with the Russians. And they're doing everything they can. At the same time, we have a good understanding that there is a discussion about the last round of EU expansion. And the doors will probably close by 2030. And Georgia does want to make the cut alongside Moldova, and Ukraine, who are also candidates. Not only Georgia, now Armenia is having, Pashinyan is in Brussels instead of in Moscow, taking pictures with the EU leadership and discussing the security assistance from the US and Europe, but the reality, Armenia is also hoping to apply for EU membership in December. So Russia, I don't think Russia can afford right now another big confrontation in the Caucasus, but who knows? They're capable of everything. They've done a lot, and then past history is teaching us a lot that we cannot be trusting them. But we are also desperately hoping that we'll escape those Russian influences and ultimately join the EU before the Iron Curtain descends again.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask about Georgia, of course, later, but as we started talking about specific examples.
If I can add one quick thing.
Okay, of course.
So they're talking about some of the LGBTQ issues. So what's interesting, a month ago, Georgian Dream Party threw this new bill about the gay propaganda, again, from the Russian playbook. Yeah. And they wanted to promote this, but somehow the opposition and the media, who are very thoughtful and strategic about it. Besides, we had a great experience in Russia, so we're learning from their mistakes. No one picked up on that. So it was completely ignored, all those populist notions of the family sanctity, because they were making the most ridiculous comments that Europe doesn't want our mothers to be called mothers and fathers to be called fathers. They want us to be called parent 1 and 2. And things like that that really sell in a traditional society. But so it didn't go anywhere. Slowly that is also dying, but clearly they have had a real attempt to exploit the topic.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I wanted to go back to Adrian and ask about other democracies. We just heard about Georgia. Other democracies that are showing concerning trends. Can you list some of those? We started talking about Hungary, Georgia. What are those other democracies that might be going maybe
in a tough moment,
the
right?
democracy?
Yeah. So I want to maybe take a step back. This is our annual Freedom in the World report, which we brought a few copies. Sorry if there's not enough. It's also available on our website. And so as part of this, we produce scores for every single country in the world on political rights and civil liberties. And what are two things that I would say, coming back to also what Tatiana said, where we have seen most of the decline around the world over the past 18 years of consecutive decline is in not free countries, so autocracies getting worse. Like the likes of Russia increasing their repression, China becoming more and more closed as a society and having less and less openness even to mild forms of dissent on non-political issues. So a lot of that, Venezuela being another example of declines over the years. So there are many of these examples, I think, from a scoring perspective, that it is autocracies getting worse that is driving the decline. And it is very much the case that in democracies, there has also been this, there is democratic backsliding happening. And where it takes place is first on civil liberties. And then after civil liberties, after curtailing free expression, the rights of NGOs, the rights of labor unions, personal autonomy, things like LGBTQ issues, the women's rights, then we start to see the declines happen in political rights. So it's first on sort of freedoms, and then it's on democracy, I would say. There is one country that unfortunately is the archetype, and it's perhaps the most important country because it's the world's largest democracy, India. They're about to have an election that's going to start off on the 19th, I think, of April. I mean, it's an incredibly massive endeavor to bring the vote to over 1 billion people who are in the country. But what we've seen is democratic backsliding happening in a sustained way over the past 10 years. Almost all of the indicators that we cover have gone down on civil liberties. very few on political rights just yet, but on the things that count around free expression, around NGOs, on journalists, there has been a substantial decline, and it has followed exactly this authoritarian playbook, where you have a party, the BJP, who Inga mentioned, is rooted in a religious extremism around Hinduism, and wanting to identify India not as a secular democracy, but as a Hindu country. And they're even talking about renaming the country and using different words to go away. And they oftentimes use this as like a way of pushing back against colonialism. So they very much play on these narratives from left and right to promote their ideology. And so what we've seen is a sustained way of, once Prime Minister Modi was elected freely, in power, that he's done everything to change the rules. So they had a new rules around electoral bonds about how people could contribute to electoral parties. He was able to keep it in place until just recently, right before an election, how convenient, where they've already been able to fundraise so much money, that now the Supreme Court has declared it unconstitutional. Other areas where they're essentially threatening to strip Muslims of their citizenship status in the country, and making it incredibly hard for those who are outside of the main Hindu religion to enjoy full rights. There are awful outbreaks of violence that are happening against Muslims, against Christians, against Sikhs, and the government isn't doing what it should be to prevent violence, because in many cases it is within their ideology of India for Hindus. And that's, I think we can all think about different countries where there is this fallback to ideology that it's not about citizenship based on civic rights and like a pluralistic idea of citizenship. It is that the country belongs to some group, some ethnic group, some religious group, and only that group. And then they go about whatever they can do to dehumanize the opposition, to strip their rights, and then to have control over all of the instruments of power. And it's just amazing to see, they have weaponized the enforcement directorate, which is essentially the law enforcement agency, so that they selectively go after the political opposition. So the main opposition party, the main national opposition party, Indian National Congress, has had their bank accounts frozen just ahead of an election. How convenient. Some of the prime opposition parties' leaders in New Delhi who have been arrested and charged just ahead of an election. So there's the selective enforcement of the law to go after political opponents, while what we've seen out of reporting is if people are charged with corruption, they switch their party allegiance to the BJP, and then all of a sudden the charges are dropped. How convenient.
Yes.
So it's making a mockery of the rule of law, and it's moving India away from this tradition of secular democracy rooted in a constitution. And that is going to be incredibly important, not only for the rights of Indians, but when we're thinking back, on the panel, we are in this struggle around global democracy. It's a battle of ideas. And if India, the world's largest democracy, is going a different way, what does that mean about other aspiring democracies out there who now see that the success that China has had economically and geopolitically, now the success that India is having economically, although there are some constraints on all of these, it's sending the message that autocracy wins, that autocracy is successful, and they're aided by all of these propaganda efforts to put out that message. So it's incredibly important, the work that USAID is doing, as we heard earlier, that the Millennium Challenge Corporation is doing, to put out this idea that democracy actually delivers. It's an incredibly important message, and it's one where, unfortunately, the global norms have really shifted, where there is a growing let's say, support for a strong man. Even in India, it's the support for strongman, according to Pew, which is then research on polling data, has gone up where it's, I think, over 70% now who say that the country would be better off if it was essentially an autocracy. So it's incredibly important that we are winning the hearts and minds of people to show that democracy matters, why it's important, how it is essential to protecting the rights that we all take for granted.
Yeah, I just want to underline like what you said, because I think probably everyone in this room was listening and thinking, oh goodness, what is happening to India? Like that sounds horrible, but it doesn't hurt Modi in any way whatsoever. And that's, I think, like where the social media and this propaganda comes in, and that I think is this new trend of informational autocrats, like this rule and this manipulation of public opinion with all of these social media tools, and why we keep trying to track what the propagandists around the world are doing, because there's no borders on the internet, as everyone knows. And this is kind of a doomsday scenario where we have countries moving towards autocracy and everyone's loving it because of online manipulation.
Would you say that the impact of propaganda on social media is more pronounced in countries with less developed institutions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because if we think that through, then it gives us some answers of what we need to be like careful about or just like work towards in the US. Because usually when I think about this, like basically false and misleading information, propaganda, which can also play up on emotions, like why is that more impactful or more harmful in like less developed democracies or democracies that are backsliding, etc. And for me, there's like two main reasons based on like tactics that we've uncovered in our work, and one is related to resources that are being employed, and the other one is related to journalism or independent journalism, the lack thereof. And the first one with resources, I think all the other panelists have already touched upon this, but kind of the impunity with which state and government money and resources are used towards also online propaganda and the manipulation of public opinion. Like three examples are on my mind, like Modi, of course, in India, Kais Saied in Tunisia, but also Erdogan in Turkey, because those are countries who have done field research in the last few years. And basically, like they use with like very openly like state resources towards their own aims, which are undemocratic. And resources can be financial resources. So you take money that is like part of actually taxpayers' money and use that towards your propaganda aims. But it can also be resources like data. Like Modi introduced the Aadhaar card, which is a national ID card in India, the information ministry, and the data that they have collected to that, they use that also for their propaganda purposes. That can be extremely effective. In Turkey, you have a government-affiliated and state-sponsored fact-checking directorate. I mean, their main job is to delegitimize any sort of opposition sources or independent media that still exists. Like, that is more impactful and harmful in those countries than, thankfully, I think still what we have in the US. And then the second part, what I think is a really interesting trend, and it will probably spark quite a discussion in this room, is kind of the lack of independent journalism, or like the suppressing of free voices and independent journalists with traditional means, but we know like tax rates, super popular, incarceration of independent voices. But here's another trend, which I find really worrying. Kais Saied, Erdogan as well, but especially Kais Saied and Modi in India love social media influencers, love them. And they love them for three reasons, at least that's what their political consultants told me. First of all, the social media influencers are more authentic and less campaigny. So you can come across with your political messages, but it's embedded in like health and wellness advice. And that way you can grow much more popular and actually spread your even Hindutva messages without coming across as like maybe confrontational or too political. The second one is that also those influencers are more controllable than journalists, even in countries where independent journalism is already severely diminished. So for instance, in India, when you've worked with the BJP as an influencer and you're on their payroll, then you're not allowed to work for Congress or something like that. So they really love that. So both of these things, like the resources that can be exploited, and then journalism, which like all of a sudden is in this huge mess where like your voices are suppressed, but then you have these competing influencers who basically just bought by the government largely. two trends where I see like the spread of propaganda, false and misleading information can be so quickly, so much more harmful and impactful in countries where those backbones are under.
But what can be done to limit the exploitation of new technologies, of emerging technologies by authoritarian leaders?
Yeah, and when I answer this question, I'm going to get a Nobel Prize afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think the main point is what I just touched upon, like what is being undermined and diminished. Those are democratic pillars that we actually need to strengthen and build. We can do that in societies and democratic systems where a lot of people are still invested in them. In other countries where those are from the top down diminished, that is much harder and it needs so much civil society pushback. But then there's also other parts that maybe are a bit easier to tackle. Like I've been saying social media all this time, right? Like social media is not an opaque space that we don't understand. It's mainly profit-based companies. So that puts these companies into certain types of accountability, in my opinion. And those are things that can be tackled by regulation, ideally international across the globe, but at least something to like really make those companies accountable for some of the ways that they are exploited. There are also more detailed ways how, for instance, WhatsApp can do more than just like highlight a message that has been forwarded multiple times. You should ask yourself as a company, do I really need to increase the size of a group chat to 1,024 people if like it's actually for my intimate communication, if it is exploited that much? So I think that is putting a lot of onus of the companies, and I don't feel confident currently that they care about that much when we see how like Twitter X has like slashed their trust and safety teams. I don't think Meta is particularly well prepared or even working enough on how their platforms can be exploited. But also there's obviously the part of just making sure like online goes to everything now in our life, right? Like I feel like every policy area, at least for me, has an online aspect. The good flip side of that is that we actually sometimes have really good laws that just would need enforcement also with regard to online stuff. So there are a bunch of paid propagandists to impersonate real people online and use that to spread propaganda. That's actually not legal in the US, but it's still done. So if that is something that would be like prosecuted better and where laws were enforced better, that would be good. And then I think the last most difficult part, but that is a conversation for all of us in my opinion, is increasing what we would call like societal resilience. So that we're aware, like for journalists and researchers, I think that means just spreading the word. Propaganda is everywhere. You can be manipulated online pretty easily. And the flip side to that, however, is like, I don't want anyone to give up on liberal democracy or be discouraged because what they see online. Like the online space is so polluted and so quickly polarized, but very often it's not real people who are doing this. It's people who are paid or the algorithm who works in a certain way. So those like in-person connections and exchanges of ideas is something that I think we also need to value in a way more than online, because no one is interfering right now, I think, in our discourse. But if we were having this on Twitter right now, I'm sure like at least 2 trolls would already be onto us.
Yeah, I would like to hear from the other panelists, you just quickly, how can we limit backsliding
Can
or
I respond
reverse
to that
it?
quickly? You know what's interesting? When this new law was proposed and then civil society groups pushed back, Facebook is big in Georgia. I'm telling you, everything is Facebook. And they put a few slides what makes it Russian, because of intent, it's in the timing, etc. So the government went and put the other slides undermining each argument. And the Facebook took it down. So all the members of parliament who were just misleading the communities about this Russian law actually were blocked for like 24 to 48 hours. It's a really interesting case study. So there is something, yes, it's not clearly ideal, but there is something that works there. There is some level of scrutiny. And that happened within hours of those slides becoming public. So some hope.
Yes, no, definitely. I think also one thing I would advocate for is that there's been so much learning also for the social media companies over the last 10, 15 years. So let's like hold on to that, like have these collaborations. I think like the Meta in particular has been investing in like, you know, more local offices and connections, et cetera, et cetera. So my hope would be in this instance, for instance, that they have good connections in Georgia who they actually could have an exchange with, saying, okay, what is actually harmful, what's deceiving?
Yeah, briefly from Tatiana and Adrian, what are your solutions? How can we limit?
I don't have a solution. I just wanted to say that it is really challenging, the task of making sure what information is being sent through the social media and how people, voters and citizens are affected. There is something else that worries me, and it is, well, even if people are affected, or in what way are they affected? Because what we see also, large segments of the electorate withdrawing from the electoral process. So they may, regardless of what kind of information, they may be so disappointed that they choose not to participate in the political process. So how do you deal with these populist authoritarian leaders who are already in power? So one thing is to mobilize people to vote. And I'm not sure that there is more effort there that needs to be put in place. But also, what are the strategies of the opposition? The electoral process requires candidates to run, political parties to run candidates. If they are weakened so much by the authoritarian leader, what we see a very fragmented opposition. One case scenario is the fragmented opposition may gather enough votes so that they don't allow the authoritarian leader to continue winning elections with the majority. But when they come together, even if they agree to form a government, it is not stable at all. It just disintegrates and falls apart very shortly after. So it is another scenario that may happen is because of the anxiety of people, because of the high degree of disappointment, they may actually go ahead and vote in support of another authoritarian person who comes up with a strong populist message. So can you beat authoritarianism with authoritarianism? Can you beat populism with more populism? And then there is another big disappointment that follows. So it goes in cycles in some countries. What we saw in Slovakia is, just to give you one example, we thought that Robert Fico was kind of somebody who would not worry us anymore, the leftist populist leader that used to be prime minister in the country for 2 or 3 consecutive terms. Then he was out of the government. He came back. He came back stronger than even before. Now he's also pro-Russian, and he uses this propaganda in the country. We'll see what happens in Poland. In Poland recently, at least the prime minister is not anymore from the Kaczynski's party, but the president is still. We'll see. It is, in some places it can be back and forth until a positive push. And we hope to see, but it is difficult for the politicians as well.
Right. What can be done to limit
I think it's
democratic backsliding?
Make your voice heard, right? Like, according to our data, what reverses democratic backsliding, what creates democratization, is people standing up and making their voices heard. So, one example, in Senegal, you had very recently a president who wanted to postpone elections. People got on the streets and said, no, we're not going to allow this. And he walked it back. An opposition politician then won the election. Hopefully, some success there. Poland, another example. People thought that all was lost, that you had a deeply illiberal party who was in power, who had done everything to capture to remove checks and balances and to win the election. The opposition still won. Turkey, another example where people felt that there was no hope. And in the recent municipal elections, the opposition won.
Only municipal.
Right, in the municipal,
and
that's where Erdogan started. He was the mayor of Istanbul, so it can be a path towards success. So, so many cases out there. Guatemala, another excellent example where a president was elected, anti-corruption president, then you had all of the corrupt forces in power do everything that they can to prevent him from taking power. People got up, made their voices heard, particularly indigenous communities in the country. And then eventually they backed down and he was able to take office. So everywhere you look, what the magic success is people just standing up and making their voices heard, whether that's going out on the streets and protesting, or in Georgia as well, right? Or it's going out to vote. So ultimately, there's not some magic button, nor would we want it that way. It's not like there's a technology that we can invent. Actually, that would be pretty dystopian. It's actually just about humans interacting with another and using what is most human about us to go out and interact with each other and to express ourselves.
Thank you so much. Now, the panel will take some questions from the audience. Eric, go ahead.
Okay, I think I can go ahead and ask. First, thank you. Thank you. This is a great panel. I did my dissertation work way back then, looking at early warning signs. And I actually used Freedom House, both Freedom in the World and unfortunately Freedom of the Press, that was published for 37 years, and unfortunately it's not published anymore, to look at liberal democracies. I remember Orban was the darling of liberal of the Western world. And I can go on a number of examples, looking at how the countries that were ranked as liberal democracies and eventually slid back. What my focus was on press freedom erosion, the early warning signs, right? You touched upon a number of them: economic asphyxiation, then the online trolls, the use of state funding, and so on. One area, as I interview people, that we don't talk about, because of course with social media, I agree, and we talked about it on Tuesday, this is super important, but it's a human factor. A lot of those effective Democrats that turn illiberal, they have hired top talent, including journalists that have come over to the other side, right? And strategic firms from the United States as well, working directly with them and in countries. And the level of resources put into the human levels to do polling, focus groups, target audiences. How do I can use the social media tools, but how do I target the message to the thing? It's tremendous. And you couple that with how independent media is, of course, going out of business, and it's almost a no-win contest. You start losing 0 to 10. And as I interviewed Reporters Without Borders, Committee for the Protection of Journalists, they would say, well, look, I know that's going, but our limited resources have to go to the places where it's not there. I'll give you one example. If you talked about Bukele, he's masterful, right? Master communicators, right? And we look now, but what was going on when he was mayor of San Salvador? I think the one thing I would ask is, just to get your impression, Art, what are some of those areas, or what are you hearing right on the other side in terms of the type of human talent? Because the social media tools don't work by themselves. There are a lot of strategies behind it. And these are not just people coming out of nowhere. They're very heavily recruited. And I've seen it off the record, a number of them that have worked for them. I mean, what do you see on the other side? An independent journalist has no chance against the resources of a state with a well-crafted teams. And more that the communicators are now at the ministerial level, even if they don't have that title. By the way, one quick note, I was in Georgia working in 06 and 07, and where Georgia back then was asking to get into the EU, but Georgians and Ukrainians couldn't even get a visa into the EU until the times rolled over to Abkhazia and South Ossetia and so on. So that's it for you.
Do you want to take a few questions?
Yes. Okay. Before we answer, just to take more questions.
Whatever. I don't know how we are on time, so.
No, we're good.
Okay,
we're
great.
Good. So, who wants to take Eric's question?
I mean, I can just quickly add a note, because I'm very focused on the online space, because I think it's so integral to our lives today, and I think it has so many political implications. But there's no technical solution, because it's not just a technical issue, but also a social issue. And building on what has been said earlier already with regard, like, okay, elections are happening, but before elections, like aspiring autocrats and autocrats like build structures, infrastructures, and that also happens in the propaganda space. Like, there's actually a bit of a paradox that, the social medias have been catching up with all of these inauthentic means of amplification, etc. So it's even more important to have the authentic ones, which is your real humans making sure that the messages are sent, that you can get people into your WhatsApp group by door knocking, things like that. So I think you just like, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have one question there. Who was?
Behind you. So yeah, quickly, I believe, before I ask a question, I believe there is a fundamental problem with what you guys, pretty much all of you were saying. And I'm gonna give you an example. When I came to this country, my sympathies were with a certain political party, okay? And they still are, specifically with the ideas, right? However, what I didn't realize is at that time is it's just because you sympathize with someone or something that doesn't mean that they're gonna be saying the truth, or that they're gonna be on your side necessarily, right? I remember these songs from George Michael. I used to say something like this: I believe in the gods of America. I believe in the land of the free, but no one told me that the gods believe in nothing. So I became disappointed with that. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that you guys seem to be biased. There is a strong bias when you're saying you're framing this argument in good versus bad. You know, there's people who tend to be authoritarian and people who are on the good side, and they will hopefully fight against authoritarianism. And the thing is, we all tend to be authoritarian. If my mother doesn't put limits on my behavior when I'm growing up, I will be a megalomaniac. We all will be. You know, anybody is an autocrat potentially, right? We all as humans, we have a natural tendency to try to get away with what we want. And if nobody puts a limit, nobody put a restraint, we'll go ahead and do it. It doesn't matter who it is. It could be, so it's not a thing of us versus them or the good versus bad. It's a matter of the institutions that exist, okay? If the institutions are faulty, which is the case of India, okay, then anybody who is in power, somebody who you sympathize with, somebody who may be saying the things that you want to hear, that person too is going to commit authoritarian things. And that's the problem I face here coming to United States. There's some people in power that I support and I sympathize with, well, they use that power to do things that were not democratic in this case. In the case of India, I personally sympathize with Modi on the things he's doing, right? Because, I mean, India was a country that was mired by abject poverty, still is, for decades. And the poverty in India is legendary, and it's mostly the result of the immense abuse of power that existed there before. This is not something new. Like there's not an erosion of democracy in India. There's never been a strong democracy in India. There's never been a strong rule of law in India. You know, what has changed is simply the party in power, the ideology in power is what has changed. Not the democracy hasn't. That hasn't changed in India. So that's how the double bias comes, because you seem to be biased in favor of a particular part of the political spectrum. So it's a double bias, good versus bad. This part of the political spectrum versus the other one. So that is how, what do you have to answer to that? Yeah.
I'd be happy to respond, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate the provocation, because ultimately this is about, trying to get to the heart of the issues. I would agree with what you said about institutions are what matter. And so when we're talking about what democracy actually means, it is institutions that account for the fact that humans are not perfect, that we don't exist in this utopian system where you trust one person to make everything better, and that this person who has this charisma about themselves, could be a man or a woman, who claims that they can solve all of the problems, and then what happens is over time they may solve some issues, because ultimately human nature and morality is complicated, right? What Freedom House is interested in is whether that person is supporting institutions or eroding them. And so it's ultimately about, is the country going to survive without them? Is it about this person, or is it about the people and where the people are going? And I think what we see in a lot of these democratic backsliding countries is that there's a shift away from trusting in institutions and for there to be actually competition between institutions. And instead, it's about centralizing all power under one party or under one person. So that's where I think actually democracy is quite realist in that it accounts for the fact that there is going to be corruption, that people are corrupt, that power corrupts, right? What are then the mechanisms that we can put in place for there to be almost competition in society to root out that corruption and to hold people accountable? So the way that a free press is almost adversarial to power. There's a reason behind that. You don't want the press out there just saying whatever the government says. You want them to be questioning. And Modi's somebody who hasn't taken a press conference in how many years, right? Like
Never done a solo press conference.
never. So it's, you know, that's. Oh, there you go. Maybe forced to do so. So those are the types of things I think, you know, it's not necessarily about, we're a nonpartisan organization. What we care about is exactly what you're talking about. It's human rights and democratic institutions. And I think that ideally, it's leaders and people who are in power who are able, either who they want to keep power and be there forever, or if they want to disintegrate all of the country's institutions for their own personal benefit. That's what we find alarming.
Okay, one last question.
Okay, I'll try and stay away from any filibustering questions that may come up. But it seems that looking at, I appreciate the zooming in on places like Tunisia, Kais Saied, Senegal, and the guy who got out of prison and became a president within a month, Slovakia and Georgia. But I think it seems that within the greater historical look at this, I'm a reporter, so we're in the front line of saying inconvenient truths and suffering the immediate consequences of that, right? So the question I wanted to ask is, seeing that these historical things go back and forth, or tides that come and go, and you know, the return of the Slovakian, and there's pushbacks, and the institutions that push back are important too. I wanted to ask, in Georgia, I wanted to zoom this question in on Georgia, about the identity of the people in Georgia, as well as it's the same question that Modi is posing to the Indians, and other people are posing, other autocrats and other politicians are posing. What is the identity of a country, the identity of a person, and identity of a people? Since Joseph Dugashvili,
which one? Stalin?
Yes, he is Georgian.
Yes.
I think his birth name was Dugashvili, yes. So the question is, in the Georgian identity, even though they want to be part of Europe, during the Soviet years, has that identity changed? And in the span of time?
It has. It has significantly. I left the country 20 years ago. And really going back, I'm seeing the next generation of Georgians who are now standing on the streets. And that is the power of education. And I want our students to listen to this, because there is no system, either online or the government, that's going to fully protect you from misinformation. We all have to get educated and become critical about the consumption of the information. And I'm seeing Georgians 20 years ago, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, and Georgians now. They're way more critical. They speak languages. They read different stuff. And they're loud. And they're not apologetic. And I think that's why I'm hopeful. So that's new identity that I want to embrace. And I'm hoping to see the results of that in next 10, 20 years.
And they're making sure their voices get heard.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panel. Thanks. Sorry. Thank you to panelists. Thank you to the audience. Great.
Thank you so much to this last panel. Before we officially close, I want to call up my colleague, Dr. Melissa Baralt, to make a few closing remarks, and this will close out our democracy conference for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Dinar. What a wonderful panel. I learned so much, and it was fascinating. You made me think about there's a wonderful book called Geek Heresy that I would recommend everybody read, and it speaks about the law of amplification and how, is it really technology? Technology will never amplify what is already not existent there. It's always human forces. So that, I think, is hopeful. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Melissa Baralt. I'm an associate professor of modern languages in the Green School. Thank you, Dean Dinar, for hosting this wonderful event today. Thank you all for dedicating this day to looking closely at some of the challenges that democracy is facing around the world. Today, we've leaned into examining some of the ways that democracy is backsliding, but we also took time to look at how democracy can be nurtured in places where it is growing, even when that growth is small and tentative. John Stuart Mill once wrote, "After the primary necessities of food and raiment, freedom is the first and strongest want of human nature." But democracy is not equivalent to freedom, but the principles of a democratic society are most likely to result in freedom for its citizens. So giving people a voice, even the most marginalized people in a society, is a central feature of a successful democracy. In countries where democracy is being suppressed, the rights of marginalized people are the first to be sacrificed, and they are often the canary in the coal mine. In Ghana, Africa's shining democracy, Parliament passed a draconian bill in February that increases criminal penalties for consensual same-sex conduct and criminalizes individuals and organizations who advocate for the rights of LGBTQ people. And just this week, riot police, which we heard about from Professor earlier, broke up massive protests outside the Parliament in Tbilisi, Georgia, prompted by a bill on so-called foreign agents that the opposition denounces as authoritarian. The bill, which is likely to pass, would require organizations receiving more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as being agents of foreign influence, and would obstruct Georgia's bid to join the European Union. Many Georgians view this as a copycat of Russia's foreign agent law, which silenced dissent there. We know that when governments begin excluding voices, it's a slippery slope. We cannot ignore these threats, especially when they are in our own backyard. Voting rights are even being eroded here in the United States, when deliberate efforts being made to suppress voting rights, particularly in Black and Indigenous communities. Native American tribe members in North Dakota nearly lost their right to vote a few years ago when the state tried to pass a law requiring voters to have street addresses, which tribe members in many states don't have because that's not the way that they organize their communities. My own work as a linguist in the Green School is second language acquisition, so I study how people learn languages. Suppressing or eliminating native languages is another way that societies marginalize vulnerable people and that democracy activists fight to protect. So as an example, we could look at the push in Spain to preserve Catalan. You could look at the Irish language, which is on the brink of extinction. Language is a symbol of identity, and freedom to speak the language you choose to speak is an indicator of democracy. Suppressing language is not what democracies do. Suppressing minority languages is not what democracies do. We've talked today about some very troubling situations, but we've also found some reasons to be optimistic, and we heard of some today from this wonderful panel. In Poland, a coalition of opposition parties was able to unseat the ruling Law and Justice Party, even though that party manipulated government-controlled media and state resources. USAID, from whom we heard earlier today, they did a report on democracy bright spots, mentioning the Dominican Republic, Malawi, the Maldives, Moldova, Nepal, Tanzania, and Zambia, noting that list is by no means comprehensive, and admittedly some of these bright spots shine more intensely than others in their commitment to democratic reform. But all are working to fight corruption, create more space for civil society, and respect the rule of law. I hope that when we all come together to convene next year, the list will be longer and the bright spots will be shining even brighter. Thank you all so much to the Green School and to my fellow speakers, as well as our partners and sponsors who made this conference so engaging and worthwhile. All of us hope you have gained not only a deeper understanding of the challenges facing democracy, but a recognition that there are opportunities to strengthen it. And students in the room, it's you guys. Shining a light on both the challenges facing democracy and the opportunities to help it grow is part of the answer. Each of us, in our work in fields that may seem disparate, linguistics, political science, they're actually all together and they're all engaged in the work of shoring up democracy. Everyone here can play a part. Learn, read, vote, speak out, even on social media. We cannot repair the whole world at once, but we can engage in the work. In fact, everyone, we must. Thank you all again so much for joining us today.